Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check, 1, 2, 3.
Good morning and welcome to the Special General Issues Committee meeting of October 15. We have quorum present both in the room and virtually for today's meeting, and I'd like to call this meeting to order. In council chambers, we have Councillor McMeekin, Councillor Cooper, Councillor Kassar, Councillor Huang, Councillor Chattison, and Councillor Maureen Wilson. Virtually, we have us joining us are the Mayor, Councillor Kretsch, Councillor Francis, Councillor Beattie, Councillor Alex Wilson, Councillor Spadafora, and Councillor Pauls. Councillor Clark will be absent today as he's chair of the Hamilton Conservation Authority and is attending that. And first up business, Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Deputy Mayor, there's one added item for information listed as 7.1C.
Great. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda? Thank you, Councillor Huang, seconded by Councillor Taddison. Any discussion on the agenda? No? Show of hands, those in approval? Thank you. That's everybody. On to declarations of interest. Any to declare at this point? Seeing none, we'll move on to items for information. So we do have several presentations today, colleagues, for our asset management plan reports. As you'll note, there is the original report that was already considered at our June 11th meeting of the General Issues Committee, which is included on the agenda for information purposes only, and that is item 7.1B. Today, the new items and new information is under 7.1A and 7.1C. The new information report A, staff will be providing 3 separate presentations on that one. So needing to make sure everybody is very clear about the process, there's going to be 3 presentations on A, and then additional information report accompanying the presentation under C. So in order to get through all the presentations, what we'll do is we'll pause after each presentation and do questions directed to the content of that presentation. And then we'll move on to the next one, do the same thing, and then the final one. And then at the end of that, we will vote to receive all of the presentations together. So each presentation is approximately 20 minutes long. So I do need a mover and seconder, and Councillor Kassar and Councillor McMeekin, or Cooper, thank you, to extend the presentation time to a maximum of 20 minutes for each of those items. So we have a mover and seconder, and is that a show of hand vote? Yep. Okay, everybody in agreement? Anybody opposed? Nobody is opposed. There we go. All right, so as noted, 3 presentations on 7.1A, which is the 2025 Proposed Levels of Service Asset Management Plan Update. And I will turn it over to Michael Wright, Director of Corporate Asset Management, to introduce.
Through the chair, good morning, Mayor and members of Council. As the City's new Director of Corporate Asset Management, I'm pleased to support the special session focused on the City's proposed Level of Service Asset Management Plan. It's a foundational component of how we steward Hamilton's infrastructure and long-term financial sustainability. As Council will recall, an initial overview of this material was presented in June. Today's session builds on that, providing a deeper look at how these plans support decision-making and service delivery across the City's asset portfolio. This work represents an extraordinary collaborative effort led by Amber Duar and Dan Leake, supported by staff across multiple divisions. Together, they've developed 27 asset management plans and a proposed level of service asset management plan that together provide Council with the tools to understand asset conditions, funding needs, and service levels, a significant achievement and a major step forward for the City. Today, Amber and Dan will walk Council through a series of presentations, each followed by an opportunity for questions and discussions. After the first 3 presentations, Dan will provide a separate presentation on embedding equity in asset management through developing a framework to support more inclusive infrastructure decision-making. With that, I'll turn things over to Amber to begin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. So as Councillor Nan mentioned, the presentation agenda we have today, so we have 3 presentations. They're each approximately 20 minutes. The first presentation is going to be an overview of our key asset management concepts. Presentation 2 is going to be how to navigate our proposed levels of service asset management plan. And then presentation 3 is providing additional clarification of our report findings, which is the real meat and potatoes of this presentation today. So with respect to OREG 58817, many of you have seen this slide before, but you'll notice the key difference on this slide now is that we have a little green check mark beside July 2025 indicating that we have achieved our requirements for proposed levels of service in our financial strategy. And before this, we have achieved all of the other regulatory deadlines as well, which are our current levels of service plans for both our core assets, which are defined as roads, engineered structures, water, wastewater, and stormwater assets, and non-core assets, which is all of the remaining assets on our city's books. And we've also completed our asset management policy. So one thing I want to emphasize on this slide is the current levels of service and proposed levels of service plans complement each other. They are not two separate things. They really, they're complementary documents that are intended to be read together. So this proposed levels of service asset management plan is really just updating all of those plans up to current replacement value with some new levels of service changes, but those other documents are still in play and can be reviewed as well. Also, what I want to emphasize on this slide is we're not done after the July 2025 deadline. We still have other requirements under the regulation. So we need to do annual reviews of our asset management plans to see how our progress is, and we have to provide that to you folks. And then even beyond that, we do need to do regular updates of our plans as well, and we have a schedule of those updates in presentation 3. So really what we're trying to do with presentation 1 is really make sure we're all on the same page with the language that we're using. So we're going to start, at the very basics. What is asset management? How are we defining it? So asset management is the coordinated activity of an organization to manage assets over their entire life cycle. And this is done by balancing cost, risk, and performance to deliver the agreed levels of service. So you've seen us use a triangle a few times. That's our cost, risk, and performance. And that's really the meat and potatoes of what asset management is, and talking about levels of service. You also see a few questions on this slide because asset management is predominantly about data as well. So what do we own? Where is it? What is it worth? What condition is it in? What needs to be done? And when does it need to be done by? And this all relates back to our data confidence piece. So we were asked in the last presentation, how do we define data confidence? So we look at data confidence from a reliability perspective and an accuracy perspective, and we have a confidence grade from very high all the way to very low. So you see that we've highlighted the cells here in pink for low to medium because that's where we are at the city right now. And that indicates that we have an accuracy between 25 to 40%. Now, I know people focus on this data confidence piece and say, hey, you guys aren't taking action, but we are. We're just saying that asset management is largely about data, and we want to be hitting that sweet spot of medium data confidence before we want to make too many decisions, especially with respect to the infrastructure funding gap. The other piece that we want to talk about with definitions is levels of service. So what does levels of service mean? Levels of service measure the outputs for services the city provides to its customers, residents, and visitors. And they're really best described as the link between the outcomes the community desires and the way that we as the city are providing those services. And ideally, as cities, we should be providing levels of service that the community wants, but is also prepared to pay for. So we need to be really clear about these concepts. And we also want to be considering intergenerational equity as well, because we want to ensure that we're not setting up future generations with the bill for the decisions that we make today. Now, asset life cycle is another thing we want to understand, and this is really key for a lot of the presentations today. So asset life cycle refers to the stages involved in the management of an asset, and there are 5 stages. So there's acquisitions, that's when we buy, build, or inherit something new that we didn't own before. There's operations, which is day-to-day activities or resources required to keep those assets or services working. There's the maintenance stage, which is planned or reactive activities that restore or fix an asset so it reaches its expected life. And then when an asset reaches the end of life, we have a decision to make. So we can either dispose of that asset, so discontinue its use and not replace it. We can renew that asset, so we can replace it like for like. Or we can dispose of that asset, and then we can acquire something bigger and better, which would be an expansion. So in terms of how this all ties together and how that reflects on the infrastructure funding gap as well, some folks have asked what is included in the life cycle needs component of the infrastructure funding gap. So this is the sort of stuff that's included, right? We take all of our needs, we break them down by life cycle stage, and all of those needs together reflect the total life cycle needs for our assets and services. And that's what you're seeing those life cycle needs are in our life cycle models. So when we look at the infrastructure funding gap, what that means is all of those life cycle needs that we just calculated, if those life cycle needs are greater than the available budget that we have, that indicates we have an infrastructure funding gap, which is that there's a funding shortfall between what is required and what is available to fund service levels. Another key concept we have in our asset management plans is our financial indicators, and these are really ratios of those needs to our budget, so we can see how our assets and services are performing. So when we look at our asset renewal funding ratio, that's us just looking at that renewal life cycle stage and understanding if we're renewing assets at the optimal time. Our target is 90 to 110%, and it's basically our budget divided by our needs, and that's how we get that value. Another indicator we look at is the 10-year operations, maintenance, and renewal ratio. So we're just looking at those 3 life cycle stages. We're taking a similar ratio. The target is still 90 to 110%, and that's really measuring the overall financial performance of the service and saying, can we afford the cost of the service? And we'll be diving more into financial indicators, especially with the results of our report, more in presentation 3, but really we're just trying to get on the same page with what these definitions are for this presentation. So with respect to how asset management should connect to the budget, this is tying all of those concepts together. So we have our levels of service in our asset management plans. We look at them from the customer perspective and the technical perspective. When we look at the customer perspective, we're asking customers how they feel about the service. So are they satisfied with the quality of the service? Is the service accessible to them? Do we have the capacity to host those customers? And then are we meeting customer needs and limiting negative impacts to them? When we look at the technical side, which is what we, the city, are doing, we look at it from the asset perspective. So are we maintaining our assets in adequate condition to deliver the service? Do we have assets of sufficient capacity to meet that need? And are our assets complying with and performing as expected? So we take all of these levels of service and we connect them to life cycle activities. So all those activities we were talking about, acquisitions, operations, maintenance, renewal, and disposal, and those life cycle activities require budget. So we have a typical graph here showing like renewal and oh, yep, for sure. Is there a part you want me to go to? Back to?
I don't know if you're rushing because 20 minutes isn't long enough or what.
Mr. McMeekin, you're asking for a point of order? Sorry for the interruption on the presentation.
Yeah, I apologize. I just, I'm trying to take notes and you know,
Your request is to slow down the presentation verbally?
Yeah,
Got it.
please.
Okay.
Okay, for sure. So I'll pause back on this slide then. So this ties everything together. So when we talk about levels of service in our asset management plans, we look at things from a customer perspective and a technical perspective. And when we're looking at the customer perspective, we're asking customers if they're satisfied with the quality of the service, if services have enough capacity and are accessible to customers, and if our services are meeting customer needs and limiting negative impacts. And then at the city side, we're looking at things from a technical perspective. So we're asking, are assets maintained in adequate condition to deliver service? Are assets of sufficient capacity available to deliver the service? And are our assets complying with regulations and performing as expected? So we take those levels of service and we connect them to life cycle activities, which is the stages we talked about previously in the presentation. So acquisition, purchase price, construction costs, that sort of thing. Renewal, what does it cost to replace that asset like for like, and operations and maintenance, things like energy costs, repair costs, that sort of thing. And those activities are connected to our budgets. So and a lot of the time, and this slide is showing a typical perspective, renewals and acquisitions often come out of our capital budget, and operations and maintenance activities typically come out of our operating budget. However, there are exceptions to this rule, and that's why in our asset management plans, we just have them divided by life cycle stage and not by budgets. So this last slide is really tying everything together, and it's what council has been asking of us. How do we get to evidence-based decision-making? So I do want to emphasize that today we're already doing evidence-based decision-making. Our asset owners are prioritizing within their blocks and doing that work, but we want to get to the point where we're using tools which will help us better use this data that we've collected to make evidence-based decisions. And as we talked about before, asset management is a journey, and a lot of these tools are in progress. So you've heard about the enterprise resource planning system, which is how we're going to get better financial data, our enterprise asset management system, which is how we get better asset data, and then we're going to be looking further into decision support software, which is how we prioritize and get that scenario modeling so that we're able to provide information at the project level and not just at the service area level. So if you look at our plans, you can see, oh, this area looks like maybe it's underfunded based on the ratios we presented. We don't have things at the project level yet, but we promise that we are working to get there, and these are the systems we need in place to get there. Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to pause for questions after this presentation one.
Thank you. We'll just take a moment to populate the speakers list. If folks could use the eScribe to indicate that you would like to speak. If you're unable to, then please indicate otherwise so I can see you. Okay, Councillor Huang, I see your hand. And then followed by Councillor Cassar. So go ahead, Councillor Huang.
Thank you, Amber. Just a question on slide 13, which talks about the actual levels of service, where you talked about the very last column spoke about capital renewals versus operational budget. But what we're seeing these days, especially when it comes to how our customers, so our customers in the community, are asking for different levels of service, they're really asking about it from an operations standpoint. However, based on that matrix, we're talking about the large chunk of it on asset renewal, asset acquisition. So how do I square that? Because if the customer is asking for higher levels, which is actually operations, they're not actually asking for a new cogeneration machine. What they want is they want better roads or they want better garbage cleanup. So how do I square that?
Thank you. The question was when citizens ask for a higher level of service, how do we fund that gap?
I think that where I'm going with this is that I want to understand the weighting, because at this point we are a straight up, this asset management plan only thinks about it from a dollars to dollars perspective. But where we see the feedback from community is that they want higher levels of service, but I don't know how we actually weight that decision versus just the straight up cost of it. So I'd like to understand, how do we rationalize how we allocate the allocation of resources? I hope that makes sense.
So with respect to, through the chair, with respect to levels of service, often they can be categorized in 3 areas. One is operational, one is council, and another is legislated. When our citizens have requests for new and different levels of service, often those flow through council back to staff in order to review and identify opportunities to integrate those plans into operational performance. And balancing those costs associated with whatever elements within the service is part of the art and science of it all. And often the large pieces are flowed through master plans. And those master plans have a series of community engagement processes that collect that type of feedback as well.
Okay, so that's how that gets informed by the asset management plan, is by the master plans, and then all of that feedback that is built into the master plan is then factored into the asset management plan. Is that how that works?
Ideally, yes.
Okay.
There are other pieces that flow through council that were integrated into this plan as well to try and provide a cost estimation over the horizon.
And welcome, Director Michael. I know you're stepping into some big shoes, so it's your first time in front of council, and we're just already grilling you on this stuff. My last question through you, Chair, is then moving forward, how do we allocate more, say, weight to what customers or community really wants? Because it seems very far removed. So we have to do a master plan where there's community engagement that gets built into some sort of a strategy. That strategy then filters into the asset management plan. But again, I don't understand the weighting. I'd like to understand how much of that is community input, because community input is also demanding from council better roads, more policing, blah, 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 all of that stuff. So that stuff I find really hard to try and lump it into the asset management plans. And then as a decision maker, it's really hard for me to understand how does that filter into the wants of the community, and then how do I balance it that way? So I'd like to understand, like, how do we understand, like, the weighting aspect of it? So that's, I suppose that's a question that can't be answered today, but it's what's kind of bugging me about all of this, is that I don't really know how we factor in the community wants into these asset management plans. Thank you.
Councillor, next up we have Councillor Kassar, followed by Councillor Crutch, then Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Chair, through you, I have a couple of questions just for further elaboration on what was presented. On slide 4, the concept of balancing cost, risk, and performance was introduced. And I understand there's a trade-off. You can't maximize performance on all those 3 things. You want lower cost, then you have to trade off risk or performance or any kind of iteration on those things. But I wanted to drill in a little bit on the word risk, because I think for anyone tuning in, the word risk can maybe be a little alarming. I think cost is understood, performance is understood, but in this context, maybe through a couple of examples, maybe staff could explain what risk means. I think it just needs a little elaboration. Thank you.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. Risk can mean a variety of potential outcomes in the future. We evaluate risk both in terms of probability and in terms of consequence. So a particular event like the weather today, if we walked outside, low probability of it raining and low consequence if it is. There are other higher consequence events that we would have to manage in a different way if they had a higher probability. Overall, it's about impact to citizens and services, especially related to essential services that people rely on every day. I'm going to pass it back to Jackie to see if she has anything else she'd like to add.
Hi, good morning. Jackie Kennedy, General Manager of Public Works. Thank you, Director Wright. I think you've articulated the response on risk, but if Councillor Kassar has something more specific, we're happy to elaborate.
If possible, can we put the example of risk into service levels that the public would see, whether it's roads or playgrounds, recreation centers, just so there's some kind of grounding on what risk means in this context. So I understand what the director said, and I agree with that. I just wanted to get on the public record just some specifics, if possible.
Okay. Sure, I can start, and then I will invite the asset management team to add to the perhaps the more asset management approach to it. But when we take, for example, the transportation block of funding, and we decide each year where we're going to distribute that amount of funding, we do look at the condition of the road. So a road that's in a more progressed state and requires more investment sooner is a higher risk of failure. We also then look at the function of that road and the community that it serves, and whether the function of that road presents higher risk if it does fail or get worse. So if it's serving, for example, a hospital, or if it's a truck route, the impacts of that road condition are higher. And so we look at those kinds of risks as we decide where we're going to distribute the block of funding to invest in those assets. Those are some tangible examples that you can picture. Other ones are when we look at bridges and where it may not be as obvious, but over recent years we've really increased the amount that we're investing into the structural components of the assets in the right-of-way in the city, and that's because the risk on a bridge is higher. If a bridge were to fail, it could be a more extreme situation and cause a safety risk. And so we elevate those considerations in our assessment of where we're going to assign that block of funding. And so in recent years, it's gone to a higher degree towards the structures or the bridges, if that helps. Yep.
Thank you very much. Those are a couple of great examples that I think are very helpful. And I just have one other question, if I may, through you, Chair. On slide 5, Amber mentioned medium accuracy is the sweet spot, and the definition of that was data set is substantially complete, but up to 50% extrapolated data and accuracy plus or minus 25%, which I understand is above where we are kind of generally with confidence levels right now. I was just hoping through you, Chair, just an elaboration on why medium accuracy is a sweet spot. It's just reading it by definition, there's still 50% of data we have to extrapolate. So I imagine there's a balance between confidence in the extrapolations and the effort and time to put into getting better data. Maybe just why we choose that as the sweet spot. Thank you.
Through the chair, we chose medium for exactly that reason. We don't want to be putting too much effort. We want to be able to take action at a certain point. Ideally, it would be high to medium, so we'd have some of our more substantial assets at high and some of our less significant, less lower replacement values at medium, and so you're sort of seeing more of that range. But if we took the average of it all, it would settle at medium.
Thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Crutch, followed by Councillor Cooper, then Councillor Taddison.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I noticed you had a 10-year cycle and renewal timeline as part of the definition here, and I wondered if you could speak a bit about that. I think when we think about timelines, oftentimes we do increments of 5, and that's just typically what we think about, generally speaking, when we look at cycles for all kinds of things. But when I think about natural assets, I don't think they conform to 10-year timelines. And I'm trying to understand, is this an organizational, institutional approach to how we consider cycles? How are we thinking about our natural assets when it comes to this 10-year timeline? Is that the right way of approaching this? I just want to get more information about that because I don't think we talked about that in detail in terms of natural assets.
Through the chair, the reason why we have the 10-year timeline is because that's what OREG 58817 stipulates as the timeline, so that's what we were following. With respect to natural assets, we're not really incorporating those in the financial indicators at this time. We're still at a low maturity for natural assets specifically. We are working on our roadmap right now. We're pulling together asset registry information, understanding our condition from a desktop perspective, which will inform field assessments and let us do more of a risk assessment on prioritizing those activities, and at that point we would start talking more about the ratios for natural assets, and you are correct that possibly 10 years might not be appropriate for those assets, but we haven't investigated that yet.
Thanks, and through the chair, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is a minimum of 10 years is important as part of the regulation, but that we might have some other scaffolding to do or other kinds of cycles to overlay when it comes to natural assets to understanding them, but like we have to meet certain regulatory functions, and so that 10-year timeline or time cycle is specific to that regulation?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next up, Councillor Cooper, then Taddison.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. One thing we don't speak to here is just our ability to procure these things and resource these things. So as an example, as I was out canvassing this summer, was a particular neighborhood that was announced from the city that they were going to get all new roads and sidewalks. I had 2 people tell me, and they said, there's no way this work's going to get done this summer. The time frame doesn't match the work. And these 2 people were owners of construction companies. And sure enough, come August, the city sent out a note saying they couldn't procure this stuff in time and they just didn't have the ability to resource it. So one of the things I'd like to see us do in this as well is to put this through a procurement resourcing lens. There's only so much that we can do with our departments scaled the way they are, and there's only so much construction ability within our community, and as you start to see cranes in our neighborhoods, that means there's limited resources. So I'd like to see us normalize this, because when you think of generational impacts, if we front load taxes and we can't deliver on what we're talking about, then we're having a generational impact on people today. And so I think we have to normalize that, but I'd be interested in staff's thoughts on how we're going to get there with that analysis as well.
Thank you for the commentary. I'll take this one. it's a really great point. There are a lot of factors at play when we are trying to deliver the capital programs that we've got before us. And you've touched on a few of those, Councillor Cooper, through the chair, including the ability to procure and the availability of industry resources like contractors to get all of the work that we need done. I think we are at this point working towards delivering the capital that we have in the sort of hopper and active in the right of way and in other areas. And as we move forward, if we're going to be increasing that, we need to look at perhaps different approaches of how we get that work packaged up and out to the industry. So if you're asking specifically about procurement, can we put together larger packages so that it's one procurement with more impact in terms of the investment that we're making? As one example, are there other delivery models that we should be looking at? So I think we're not there yet, but it's a great line of thinking, and I look forward to working on that with the team.
Okay, through you, Chair. As we iterate through this, maybe we can bring something back to see what our level of procurement resourcing is as we look to normalize this, and so that it's realistic. The other thing I was wondering too is that question through you, Chair, is this really we're looking at own model as opposed to lease? Like, so we're getting to the financing aspect of this, right? And all this has a tax impact. I'd like to see actually, as we iterate through this, what the tax impact is for 26 and forward, because ultimately this is going to impact our residential homeowners. But I'd also like us to look at different financing options as we iterate through. I didn't see it in the roadmap, but it's probably happening somewhere. You know, if that could happen as well, through you, Chair.
Through the chair, the financing, some preliminary information was provided through our September 11th budget, 2026 budget outlook, and will continue to come forward through the balance of our budget deliberations for 2026. It is asset management is a driving theme with respect to our 2026 budget of the forecasted increase. Asset management represents about 3.37% of the forecasted 8.9%. So roughly about a third of the increase is asset management. With respect to how we deliver those services, that continues to be a work in progress with respect to owned operated facilities, having P3s. We've had some experience at the City of Hamilton with respect to P3s, whether it's our biosolids facility at our Woodward treatment plant. We've had recreation where the city owns, but private sector operates and maintains. So that does form part of our discussions and deliberations, and I expect it'll continue to form part of it with respect to what is the best financial delivery model with respect to those facilities. Is the city in a better financial position to lease space versus own space? And that is part of the work that staff undertake when they look at facilities. In fact, we have a policy that requires if we lease space, we have to compare it to owning the space and present to council what is financially the best path forward.
Through you, Chair, and thank you for that. When I think about the confidence level, 25 to 40, I would just categorize that as relatively low, and that was in the presentation. How, as council, do we get comfort around this, other than maybe to benchmark our peer group, okay, to understand what other cities are doing, what their numbers are coming in at? I'm wondering, through you, Chair, if we could have that as part of this going forward.
The definition or the goal of the data confidence over time?
Or the ability to bring back benchmarking to our other peer cities?
In terms of data confidence?
Through the chair, we actually did a municipal scan of other municipalities, and other municipalities aren't being as transparent about their data confidence. We were trying to be as transparent as possible using that scale, but we haven't seen other municipalities showing it as transparently as we have at this point.
Thank you, Councillor. That brings you to your time. If you have more questions, come on the second time. Councillor Taddison.
Just want to thank my colleagues for some great questions, helping me understand our asset management plan here as well. I just wanted to look at just a couple of definitions. Forecasted life cycle needs. I guess my question is, how do we determine the length of time that an asset is viable? Is that something written in a manual by the producer or the manufacturer, or does the city staff actively go out and remotely check assets?
Through the chair, that depends on the asset. So for some assets, it would be in the manual, but for some of our other hard infrastructure, that's really the experience that we've had with our assets, and that's where that data comes in, right? So the more data we collect, if we understand the age of those assets, we can start to predict the average lifespan for those assets in similar situations.
Okay, I get that. So I just wanted to ask one more question about field assessments. I heard that term. How many, and through the chair, sorry, how many staff across the corporation would actively be involved in field assessments? Is that something that we can get a hold of, or is that just too big a question?
I think it is a hard one to pin down. The group that was involved in the data collection to date is pretty enormous. I think it says in the report it's 26 different groups that we've worked with to collect all of this information. It's been a very collaborative process with obviously staff through the ranks contributing to the data. So it is a large number of staff that provide this. The frontline staff that do the work on the equipment play a role in collecting all of this information. But I don't believe we have a number. But Amber, you can no. So.
Through the chair, we also rely on students as well for some of this data collection, which can improve efficiencies.
Okay, thanks for that. I recognize it's a bit of a naive question because I think everybody that is out in the field could possibly be somebody that is contributing to the data. I just wanted to know if there's like a special team or something, like say for roads or bridges, that actually that's their entire focus, or is it just that's one part of many different jobs for people?
And I think it does vary. Thank you for the question. It does vary depending on the asset that we're dealing with. So for bridges, there are legislated inspections that are required on a routine basis. So it's every 2 to 4 years. I think it's every 2 years on bridges that we have an inspection that's required, and we do that with a team overseeing it in Public Works, with consultants who are experts in that area who can go and look at the structures and make those determinations, write reports, and then we review them and prioritize them within the city team. For roads, we have inspections that go on routinely, and for sidewalks, as Amber Dewar mentioned, we have students that go out. So there is a range of skill sets and personnel, and we try to do that as efficiently as we can.
Okay, thanks. And I think that what I was trying to point at is that something that's a repetitive, if it's a repetitive in nature, is it better to maybe hire internally as opposed to using consultants based on, has there been any cost analysis between, the position of consultants versus and contractors versus permanent staff?
When we're approaching the different kinds of assets, we look at the specialty of the skill sets. So in the case of structures and bridges, having consultants who are specialized in that is a fairly typical approach for an owner to take, where the experts are able to stay current with that specialty, and it also helps with some of the risk, managing that risk and taking that outside of the city's oversight. So we in effect have a partner in that has some insurance and requirements for it. And for lower risk aspects, we take a different approach.
Okay, thank you very much.
Next up, we have Councillor McMeekin, followed by second-time Councillor Cooper.
Yes, thanks very much. It's an awesome report. It's the kind of thing you can't pick up once you put it down. I'm kidding, of course. Lots of reading there, and or not. There's so many aspects to this. It's hard to which is probably why we have three presentations now, how collectively to approach it. But there are two issues, Chair, that I have a particular interest in exploring. One is decidedly urban and the other is decidedly rural. The decidedly urban one has to do with the water sewer system, the joint system, that I think many of us for many years have begun to think of it as being something, if we were to do it over again, we wouldn't do it the same way. It's very dysfunctional, very expensive to fix things. I noted with some considerable interest this morning, and as I was getting my morning fix of newspaper ink, read my 4 newspapers in the Globe and the Star this morning, there was a reference to the federal government acknowledging some of the similar problems in Toronto and allocating some $460 million to entirely rework the sewer system for some 360,000 residential homes. So I just want to flag that because we're into asset management. It'd be nice to have explore some partnership funding, and that's a massive one. I've heard estimates of up to $2 billion to rebuild a system that consistently and predictably fails us. So I just flagged that as a matter of interest. The other is rural roads. I think I heard the general manager muse appropriately about the connection between road and risk, and I think she may even have mentioned used that in connection with sometimes risk is enhanced when it involves trucks. The biggest and most consistent complaint I get from half of the geographically rural area of my riding is, my ward, sorry, and probably in some other wards as well, is around the quality of rural roads and potholes and the big trucks and the risk there. Enforcement's difficult because it's only done by our Hamilton Police Services, and they have priorities in terms of volume of traffic and enforcement. So I know this. I think we created a rural roads task force to look at that, and so those are two areas that when we get to the point where we're talking about asset management, where I intend to have some focus going forward, and I promise to do a little bit more research on both areas. But I just flagged that for the general manager and appreciate her comments about trucks and roads and rural roads. I remember taking Director Rael through there, and she couldn't believe I used my wife's new car because my car wouldn't have survived hitting those potholes. Anyhow, enough said. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. And I'm just going to remind my colleagues around the table, this is a period for questions on the presentation. I've given some latitude to commentary because I understand you're putting context to your questions, but if I don't hear a question, I'm going to move you along really
so my
quickly.
question is, will you be intentional about focusing on water
Within
sewer systems and rural roads? Thanks.
Okay.
Assuming the answer is yes. But.
You're looking for an answer to the commentary, or the last question, General Manager.
So we do have to make tough decisions about where we invest the money. There are, as we've seen, there are more needs than there has been investment into the assets over the years, and so that's a big part of why you're seeing the condition that they're in today. So we do have difficult choices to make as we continue to invest them, but we look at all of our assets.
Thank you. Next first-time speaker is Councillor Pauls.
Thank you, and through the chair. I'm looking at the asset management connection to the budget, and I see that under the function, it is under operating budget. My question is, when the operation of that facility, especially a rec facility, costs more than the renewal, costs more than the disposal of it, why do we keep them? Because I know there's some facilities we have that have been there for a long time and they're always breaking down. When do we decide that the operation of that facility should be disposed of?
So specifically around the criteria of decision-making around
Yes.
disposal versus anything else.
And when do we say, okay, it's a new capital, we need to expand or we need to dispose of it? When is that decision? When the operating costs more?
Through the chair, we do go into this a little bit more in presentation 3, but it is a service area specific decision. So we do have building condition assessments, for instance, that indicate what needs are on that facility, and using that data, the service area would make a decision of what would work best for them, speaking to your point.
Great, I'll look forward to listening to the third one, the third presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Councilor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of this work and for setting this day aside. I think this information is critical to our fiduciary responsibilities. So thank you. If I could just pivot to where we began on the questions from Councillor Wang, I think I need a little bit more help tying the information together from a councillor perspective. I thought Councillor Wang's question, and she can please correct me, was what informs our decisions around levels of service? And in summary, what I thought I heard was we have master plan activities. Embedded in that master plan activity are opportunities for public consultation. The input from that public consultation informs us about expectations around levels of service. Is it fair? So there's that. And then I thought we heard from your June or July report that the existing deficit for our assets is overwhelmingly, I think the figure was around 80% within the existing built system. I guess my first question is how, if I've heard that correctly, and if I've heard the question correctly, if master plans are overwhelmingly executed for new developments, how do we avoid a continuation of not reconciling the existing deficit with the new? That's what I'm struggling with in these exercises, and whether this is the appropriate point for that question, or it may become evident at the end of the remaining presentations. I think from a policy perspective, that is what, because here's some opinion. In the scarcity of revenue and resources, we have kind of leaned into a Ponzi type exercise of revenue dependency from new development. That new development then becomes a legacy of deficit. And we are layering deficit upon deficit because of our because of the lack of because of an inappropriate fiscal framework. That just creates a new dependency when we're talking about intergenerational equity. It becomes inequitable. So I don't know how in this, going back to the original question, how we reconcile that distinction between new and existing old so that we don't further create a gap in that, through the chair.
So I can start, and I will perhaps ask General Manager Zegeric to join into this as well from the financial perspective. I think that the asset management plans and the documents that we've now got do a really good job at articulating where we are and giving us really good information to have these conversations about the reality of the infrastructure state, the number of assets that we have, and the investment that we need to make to maintain levels of service. And so when we're talking about the financial piece of it and where that funding comes from, I'll ask General Manager Zager to contribute to that piece more. But it really does come down to choices of what state do we want the infrastructure to be in, what does that level of service then look like, and how much are we willing to invest in it. So the intention of these asset management reports is to be transparent with council and the public about what we've got and the cost to maintain it, or to, as you articulate, Councillor Wilson, through the chair, to add on to that with new infrastructure or higher levels of service.
Through the Deputy Mayor, I apologize, I didn't introduce myself previously. Mike Zager, General Manager, Finance Corporate Services. Committee would have seen through the September 11th outlook that we are trying to accommodate both supporting development and growth along with asset management. And in part, that is what's contributing to the 3.37% capital financing contribution that's reflected in the outlook. What that really means is, with respect to growth enabling projects, we know and we recognize that those projects are not entirely funded from development charges. We have statutory and discretionary exemptions. So we are facilitating and accommodating the delivery of those growth enabling, inclusive of funding those development charge exemptions. In addition, we're embarking on a 10-year financing plan or strategy with respect to the core assets and a 25-year plan with respect to the non-core assets. And so there isn't a trade-off or a prioritization of one over the other. What's reflected in our financing plan and our 2026 budget outlook is supporting both growth and development as well as asset management. You would have seen through the presentation this morning is the more disciplined approach towards asset management, which speaks to the birth of assets and the retirement of assets, and factoring in that full span of life for those assets. And so it's critical in the context of intergenerational equity. I'll use one asset as an example, that we start thinking towards the retirement of our landfill, such that when our landfill comes to end of life, the cost associated with decommissioning that landfill does not become a burden for the next generation, that this generation who is contributing towards that landfill are contributing financially towards the decommissioning of that landfill. That's what asset management theoretically supports.
Councillor Wilson, did you have any follow-up questions on the responses?
Not at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so that exhausts our first-time speakers. Back to second time now. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question through you. So over the number that's being mentioned right now in terms of a tax increase is 4.25%. If I understand correctly, we're saying today that 3.37% of that is related to this discussion today. Is that correct?
In terms of the projection, it was the context versus the new 4.25. But over to you, General Manager.
Through the chair, yes, I should clarify the 3.37 is not just asset management. I mentioned the development charge exemption. So all of those factors that contribute to infrastructure, tax-supported infrastructure, is rolled into that 3.37% forecast.
Thank you. When it comes to assets, one of the things that we should probably look at is asset rationalization. And I don't know if we've done that, but my question through you, Chair, is to say, have we done asset rationalization as part of this exercise, or is it a following exercise? How does that tie in?
Through the chair, our life cycle activities include the full spectrum of from acquisition through to maintenance, operation, and then disposal. The piece that I'm hearing in your question is related specifically to how do we produce efficiencies and identify assets that need to be disposed. Is that correct?
Disposed and not replaced, because if you do the asset rationalization, you're not replacing everything. You're replacing it with a goal of where you're going. So if we have, for example, 2 rec centers close to each other, we say, you know what, would that be 1 rec center? But we can't get there until we do the asset renewal. But we have to have that plan in place, because all we're doing is replacing like for like, that may not be the optimal answer.
Through the chair, this is a great question. Again, going back to those master planning processes, that's where a lot of these service-specific decisions are made in terms of how many community centers are appropriate for a neighborhood and across the city. It does have an equity component baked into it, but we would look to those master plans that identify opportunities for efficiencies and cost savings in order to provide the levels of service to the community that they expect.
And I use that simply as an example. There's other things we should be looking at. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to look at that as part of this. The other thing is, we don't have an enterprise risk management framework, from what I understand, which gives me the impression we don't have a risk appetite. But let me ask, do we have a risk appetite as a city in terms of understanding how we approach risk? Because this is integral to this discussion, as my colleague mentioned earlier. Risk is a key component, and without risk appetite, we're all going to see this differently and evaluate it differently and come to very different conclusions.
Through the chair, it's a great point. Further development of a risk management framework and approach with the data that we've collected now that we've assimilated all of the assets across all services citywide is a great example of next steps that we'll be further developing and integrating into the expected updates to the asset management plans that will be forthcoming.
So one of my concerns is, by not having an overall risk appetite across the city, not only do we bump into things like cybersecurity, we bump into it here. And the real impact is, this is a dollar impact on the community. So I think we need to at some point pause and understand what a risk appetite is as a city, so we can make these kind of decisions. The other thing is, we iterate through this and we have conversations with the community. Community is going to express to us what their level of service is. But when it translates into a dollar amount, a tax increase, that has a tendency to, I'll say, modify the conversation. And so as we talk about these things going forward, I'd like to always see it expressed in terms of a tax rate. So when we're prioritizing and we're talking about what should be done, everything's not a first priority. But as we start to work through that and iterate through, I think we should always have that conversation with the tax rate. And I'm asking, can we do that when we have these conversations, whether it be with the community, master planning, whatever it is, to say, let's translate that into a dollar figure.
Through the chair, that's the best practice with asset management, is also providing the cost of the service, as well as while you're soliciting feedback in terms of if that's a desired and a want. I wonder if anyone else would like to add to that.
So just to clarify, was to contextualize the definition of asset risk and investment in terms of tax increase.
Yes.
So I will take a shot at it, and I think General Manager Zagarek may add too. The short answer is yes, it sounds like something we could do. How do we get there and figure out what the format of that communication is, so that it is accessible and clear to everyone who needs to receive it? I think there's some work in that piece of it. But as we move forward with our plans and how we articulate those back, I think it is part of the budget process. And we often come back with council referred items where there were requests made that would impact the tax levy. And so we have those discussions. So I think I can say that I hear your question. I don't have a definitive answer today.
I'll just leave it with you because, I just starting that conversation, really. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Over to the mayor.
Thanks very much. I just want to go back to the issue of our master plans that was raised by, I think, initially Councillor Wang and then Councillor Maureen Wilson. And we recently completed, well, not that recently, but fairly recently, completed the Parks and Rec master plan. And then we had to go and do the implementation plan for the master plan. And so I just wonder how long, what's the average amount of time spent on putting a master plan together and then getting to an implementation plan and then finally getting to implementation of the master plan? Is there a time frame that's kind of average or expected for those kinds of exercises to be undertaken? And I raise that as a question because we heard that the way that the input from public is assembled or is identified is through the public engagement that happens with the master plan process. But if the master plan takes 10 years to actually create and then begin to implement, that public feedback is no longer current. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of how the master plans flow in terms of timing, how long they take, and then how long it takes to then create the implementation plan. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The master planning process, it can really vary depending on how much we are looking at the plan including, but probably a 3 to 5 year time frame. And the master plan process is one that is part of the Environmental Assessment Act with the province, and so there's prescribed reporting requirements that we follow on that. So with the public consultation and the reporting piece, there are some schedule risks to that we try to manage. But I'm going to say that based on my experience, it's a 3 year to 5 year time frame is probably realistic. And then the master plan would report out on the plan sequencing of the rollout of the recommendations. And so there would be some that would be rolled out within a few years thereafter, depending on how much design and then construction work is required. And some of them could be further out into the time frame. So it is, I think, a very fair statement to say that in some instances, when we get to construction, the public input is quite dated.
Thanks very much, through you, Chair. Thanks very much to our GM for that explanation. I guess the question that it raises, though, the response raises another question, which is the implementation piece. So after the 3 to 5 year plan is put together, the master plan, and then there's the creation of an implementation process and or financing or funding. And I guess my question is, does that not respond to what Councillor Cooper was raising around how do we determine the financing, the funding, where does that land in terms of our budgeting processes, et cetera? So can I just get, because we saw that with some of the pieces that we just did with our Parks and Rec plan. So can I get a bit of clarification on that? If I'm being clear, through you, Chair?
Yes, so through the Chair, the master plans themselves do not necessarily commit to the funding, but they can identify generally a high-level cost estimate for the infrastructure investments that will follow. And then through the budgeting process, those costs would be identified for the year of investment that's required and would go through budget approval at council based on the process and the year that they're being forecasted for, with increased accuracy the closer we get to the actual investment. So when the master plans are being done, I think that because it's a master plan, and by nature of that, there is some planning horizon times that are built into it. The budget 10-year forecast that we developed and put before council would include projects that are being contemplated through those master plans. I believe that's work that we already do as part of the budget forecast, and I'll ask GM Zager to weigh in on that as well.
Thanks. So we recognize master plans are really visions as it relates to future visions, as it relates to municipal programs and services. And while those vision documents have a time horizon and some forecasted implementation dates for facilities and programs, the budget process really embeds the financial realities relative to those vision documents. And as part of the budget process, we assess whether or not, for instance, if it's a growth project, whether or not the growth has been realized in order for the city to financially support that additional development of that facility, or whether or not the forecasted tax or rate impacts can support those additional investments as it relates to the facilities and the program. And so the budget process really layers on the financial realities or restrictions of the community as it relates to the ability to pay and ability to support those recreations. And we see that tension with respect to, for instance, where growth has occurred. I'll use the example of recreation facilities, where a community expects a recreation facility to be in place, for instance, at 50% development of that community. But in reality, the city won't have the financial means to proceed with that facility until almost complete build out of that community, because it's driven by development charges and collecting that revenue stream. And so I'll just add, the budget process really layers on the realities of the financial realities and the timing and capacity to proceed with those projects versus the master plans, which in some ways are a visionary document in terms of the delivery of the programs and the needs of the programs within the identified time period, whether that's 2031, in some cases 2041, and eventually we need to move to 2051. Thank you.
Thanks very much through you, Chair. Thanks to GM Zagarek and GM Kennedy. I have other questions, but I'll take them offline. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that exhausts our speakers list, and we have completed the component of the presentations covering off the concepts around key asset management. Now we're going to move on to a presentation about navigating proposed levels of service asset management plan, and over to Senior Program Analyst Dan Leakey. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Dan Leake. I'm a Senior Program Analyst in Corporate Asset Management. And one of the themes that we heard from the last time we were at GIC was just a little more help in understanding how to read the document, recognizing it was a large document. So this is really just a quick presentation on how to help navigate the volume of work that we've produced for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our asset management plans that we've done to date and the overview, and then go into the navigation of the document. So as Amber actually said, we prepared our current level of service asset management plans back in 2022, 23, and 24. And then that was to meet the regulatory deadline to have current level of service plans in place. The most recent work document we prepared was the proposed level of service asset management plans, which we presented to GIC back in June. But those are not standalone documents. Those two documents are meant to be read together. The first document, the current level of service asset management plan, was an extensive deep dive into each individual asset area, 26 different plans. Those documents are approaching 100 pages each. and they're standalone documents for each service area. In the proposed level of service asset management plan, we combined all 26 service areas into one document to facilitate the work that we did. But those documents really should be read together. And then another document I'll point out to Council is we created our corporate asset management overview, and that was Appendix B to the last report we prepared. And that document really outlines our asset management philosophy, how we do our calculations, what kind of inputs we consider. It has the asset or the data quality table is in there. Our condition assessment tables are in there. How do we decide something is very good condition or very poor condition? And it also has our glossary and definitions as well. So it's kind of an overarching document that outlines how we implement and do asset management to date at the City of Hamilton. Just really stepping back to what information is available to Council. So in those current levels of service asset management plans, we had a background and a detailed asset registry. We had our first iteration of levels of service, and really that was about, what are the expectations that people want from us, and how are we living on those expectations? And I'll just add here, in our first asset management plans, we actually did customer level of service surveys. So we actually did do surveys reaching out to the public to ask about condition, function, and capacity of the assets and services that we do provide. We would like more take up on those surveys when we come around in the future, but we think that's also a really good way to get the customer voice and the public's voice into how we're delivering on our commitments to service. We then looked at demand. So we asked asset owners to go through what does your demand look like in the future? How many assets are we going to need? Do we have a master plan in place that already speaks to this? We then took all of our asset owners through a risk management exercise. So we do have a risk management framework in place, but it was very high level. And we really, in the asset management plans, we documented the very high level risks and identified mitigation plans for those. And ideally trying to identify, is there a cost that we may need to consider to mitigate this risk that we may need to build into an asset management need. We also looked at climate change. So we looked at how asset owners or service areas, how are they doing climate mitigation? How are they doing climate adaptation? We put together our first life cycle management plans. So basically that's how do we manage our assets through the various life cycle activities. We did our financial management plans. So we calculated our first asset management ratios that Amber talked about, and we calculated our first infrastructure gap. And then because it was our first time doing this, we said, how do we get better? How do we make these plans more, how do we improve our data confidence? How do we get better field data? So we have a number of continuous improvement plans on improving our asset management processes. So that's all in the current level of service plans that we did. So there's information in there that can help Council with some of the decisions that you're looking to make. Each of those reports has a 2-page scorecard of major findings for each service area, which is really the executive summary. We have age and condition profiles by major asset category and have some brief examples to show you. We identified our first levels of service with targets where targets were available, and we did our first 30-year life cycle management plan. And then, as I said, we calculated those 10-year financial summaries where we did our asset renewal funding ratio, operations, maintenance, and renewal ratio, and our funding gap. So I don't want you to focus on the content of this particular graph. It's more, this is the type of information that's available to you. So this is just an example of some of the information that's in those current level of service plans. So we did an age profile for all of the major asset categories. So that is in the current level of service plans. And with this age profile, you can actually see the distribution of when we've acquired those asset categories. So that really tells you about how our funding has historically been over time. So on the left-hand column, you'll see is the estimated replacement value, and across the bottom is the year of acquisition where it's known. So this exists for all of our major asset categories in the current level of service plans. And so you can see if we have, funding blocks dedicated at certain times, and it's likely that those renewal needs will proceed into the future with a similar pattern. And so this information coupled with the estimated service life, which is also documented in our asset management plans, would show roughly when we may forecast renewal needs based on age. We also have the distribution of condition by major asset category. And so again, really didn't put this up here so we focus on the numbers on this particular slide, just showing that this is the kind of information that is available for each service area by major asset categories in the current level of service asset management plans. So you can see how the condition is distributed across the assets in that category. So this can also help inform some decision making if this is the kind of condition profile or condition distribution that we're satisfied with or unsatisfied with, then we could make plans to alter this distribution. So jumping now to proposed levels of service. So all the plans we did before July 1st, 2024 represented our benchmark for current levels of service. So our proposed level of service plan represents what levels of service the city has proposed to provide since the development of those original plans. So really when we looked at proposed levels of service, there were three options. It's either a service enhancement, so we're going to increase our service level. It's a service reduction, so we're proposing a decrease in service levels. Or there's no service change. We're just going to maintain, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. So for service areas that hadn't formally proposed any changes since their last asset management plan, it was assumed that the previously reported service levels were being maintained. And then, because the plans had been done in 22 and 23 and 24, we took the opportunity to update all of the asset registries and recalculate the infrastructure funding gap to bring it all into like a single year current amount. So the proposed level of service report covers 26 service areas across 438 pages. But really, it's 26 service areas with the same 3 blocks of repeating information. So under each service area, we have an updated summary of the assets. We have the proposed levels of service identified, and then we have the update and recalculation of the financial sustainability metrics. And all of that sort of filters down into the section 1, which is where we outline the methodology for the report. We do a summary of our findings, and in the back of that report, there's an annex that has tables that summarize all of the area's findings into 2 tables. And that's really 38 pages. So how do I navigate this document? So this is the table of contents. So sections 2 to 6 are the core level service asset management plans: water, wastewater, stormwater, roads, engineered structures. And sections 7 to 27 are the non-core plans, and they're all arranged alphabetically. In the digital document on the city's website, it's all linked. So you can click on any of these areas or links, and it'll take you right to the section that you're interested in. So if you're really interested in roads, or you're interested in engineered structures, you would be able to just click on that link. It'll take you right to that section of the document, which facilitates navigation. You'll see, too, that the table of contents repeats. So as an example, engineered structures, 2.1 is the description of the service area, 2.2 is the summary of assets, 2.3 is the proposed level of service, and 2.4 is the calculations of the financial sustainability of the service. And you'll see that just repeats over and over again. So it's really a lot of detail if you want to go into the detail, or you can go into the annex that has the high-level overview. So I'm just going to walk really quickly through the report sections. Again, I have examples out of different reports, so it's not one comprehensive report top to bottom. It's really just snapshots to kind of show you the information that's available and the detail that's available at. So as I said, section X is the generic term for the section area, but point 1 really contains a brief description and overview of the service area, just to describe to the public what this service area does. So section point 2 is our updated asset summary. And you'll see what we've done is, because we had an asset registry in our current level of service plans, and we have an asset registry in the proposed level of service plans, we've got both those figures side by side. In the interest of transparency and accountability of the work we're doing, we want to show, here's the number we presented before, here's the new number we have today. You can do those comparisons, and we've identified at the bottom the difference in the numbers where it's available, and we've also identified the reason for the change. So we've attempted to put a reason for why the number we're presenting today is different than the number we said last time we were in front of council, so that we're trying to be factual and open in the work we're doing. And you'll see we also have our data confidence across the bottom. So we have those grouped by major asset categories, and then the bottom of every service area, we have a sum total for that service area. And there we'll have an updated replacement value, a weighted average age, and a percent RSL is remaining service life. So that's the estimated remaining service life for all of the assets in that service area. And then you'll see we have a weighted average equivalent condition. Now, the way we do our weighting is we use the replacement value of the asset as the weight that it contributes to those categories. So these totals then are carried to the bottom in Annex A, and these are summed at the bottom of the report. So section 0.3 is our proposed level of service section. So if you're interested in that, this would be the section of the report to go to. So this 3.1 is our approved level of service changes. So each approved individual level of service has this table. And in this table, you'll see we've given it a name. We have our level of service statement. And then we have what is this change type. Again, there was enhancement, decrease, or maintain. And then we have our customer level of service. So what does this change mean for the public? How do they interpret this change? And then you'll see to the right of that, we have our technical level of service. So as the city, how are we going to factually measure the impact of this change? And you'll see we have identified the current, and then we also have the proposed. We then break down what we believe to be the capital budget requirements to implement this change and the operating budget to implement this change. And you'll see these are 10-year differences. This is over 10 years. And then you'll see our attempt to identify the funding source where this funding would come from. And then at the bottom, you'll see the source. So that is actually the document where this data comes from. So in this example, it came from an existing report to council that was approved. And then all of these individual proposed levels of service, we carry down to the bottom of the report, and they're summarized in tables in Appendix 8.2. We also do a risk assessment on the approved levels of service change. So because we're implementing a proposed level of service, that may introduce new risks or it may address an existing risk. So you'll see we have these risk assessment tables where we identify the service or asset that's at risk. We talk about what could happen if the change wasn't implemented. It's assigned a risk rating. We have a risk treatment or a risk mitigation plan, and then we identify the residual risk. We also have a section in the report that's not approved level of service changes. So at times, asset owners may bring a proposal for a level of service change that doesn't get approved, and we just document that in the report. Another section is activities required to maintain levels of service. So because the city is always growing, we're always expanding services to maintain our level of service. So this is not about changing our level of service. This is about activities that we have done to just keep delivering the same level of service. A lot of time you can think of it as a ratio. If we have a ratio of, police officers, or we have a ratio of ambulances to people, then as we add people, we need to add more ambulances. And so that would also come likely with an increased funding request or a specific business case to catch up. But that's not really about changing levels of service, that's about just maintaining what we're doing. So we do have a table as well where we identify business cases or in your funding requests that are linked to that. We also do a risk assessment on that as well, and it's a similar table. So you'll see, we identify what could happen and our risk treatment or mitigation plan. Because we may identify new risks, or we may resolve existing risks, again, by implementing these changes. And then we have an updated life cycle management plan. And you've seen these graphs before, but I'll walk through how to interpret them. So what you'll see left to right in the bars is those are the life cycle activities. Those are the forecast needs that we've worked with the asset owners and identified what the needs are. You'll see on the left-hand column there for 2025, there's a really large bar. That large bar in these plans is typically the backlog. So that's typically renewal backlog is what's contributing to that. And the definition for renewal backlog is items that are in very poor condition, that are still in service, or assets that have exceeded their estimated service life and are still in service and should be ideally considered for renewal. So that's where that bar typically comes from. You'll see these bars are broken up into the life cycle activities that Amber talked about: acquisition, maintenance, operations, renewal, and disposal. The solid black line across the top is our budgets. So typically what we have for budgets is we have the current year plus a multi-year for operating, and then we also often have a 10-year capital forecast. So you'll see that's what's generally creating that budget line. And we do our forecasting out over 10 years. The blue line is what it would take to close the gap. So if we add up every time the bars exceed the line over 10 years, and then we divide through by 10, we sort of get an annualized gap amount. And that's what the blue line represents. So that's what the funding would be to close the gap for that service area. And you'll see in the top right, we have our asset renewal funding ratios that Amber talked about, our 10-year operating maintenance renewal funding ratios, as well as our projected funding gap. And that number is over 10 years. In section 4.2, we've updated our financial indicators, and again, we've shown what we showed in the last plan, and we've shown our updated amount, and we've also given a reason for the change. We also have a summary of the 10-year infrastructure funding gap. So again, this table shows the main drivers that contribute to the funding gap. We've kind of put the funding gap into categories. Is the gap, what component of the gap is related to growth? What component of the gap is related to maintaining current function? What funding of the gap is an approved service change that might be unfunded? That didn't happen in this case. And then you'll see we have an updated calculation of the infrastructure funding gap. And then where it changes, we actually have we've tried to identify as reasonable as we can the reason for the change, again, to identify to council and the public why the numbers are changing as they are. And that brings us to the annex at the end of the report. So the annex has really two tables. So this table you'll see compiles the value, age, average remaining service life, average condition, the renewal funding ratio, the 10-year operation maintenance and funding ratio, the funding gap per year, and then the funding gap over 10 years, as well as our data confidence. And this table is alphabetical. So this really pulls all of the summary data into one spot to be used for information. And then lastly in the report, we've summarized all the proposed level of service changes that have been proposed to the mayor and members of council for new activities or services and identified their impact to overall life cycle costs. So in this table, you'll see we have the service area name, the name of the approved level of service change, the year that came forward, typically through a business case or an in-year funding request. And then you'll see we've attempted to tie it back to the source documents so that people can go back and look and see where these numbers came from. And then you'll see the 10-year capital budget impact and the forecast 10-year operating budget impact. And then where possible, we've identified the funding source. And again, this table is in the back of the report as well. So I hope that helps give some, I know it's a lot of detail, but it's really about, that's kind of the information that's available in the work we've done to date, and that's kind of the information that's available to council and the public as well. So hopefully that helps navigate that report a bit.
Thank you so much for that overview and walkthrough. It's a lot clearer for me. Over to our speakers list, we have Councillor Huang and then Councillor Kretsch.
Thank you. Manager Dan, I have questions on slide 18 of 23. That's the one that says section X.4, financial sustainability of service. And I get what the information is telling us, but I think I'm still trying to understand how we've come up with those trend lines in terms of budget versus the gap and all of that stuff. Because if you look at slide 18, it says that 2025 has the largest sort of backlog, and yet we have the smallest amount of budget, and then the next 10 years you see this up and down. So how did we get to that up and down? Because intuitively I would have said if there's a backlog, it would have been a slope down versus a up and over. Can you just explain this slide again to me? Slide 18.
I recognize the challenges with this slide. And I think Amber also has a bit of a discussion in her presentation as well, so you'll get to see this slide again. So through the chair, what you're looking at in that graph, slide 18, is the budget does go up and down. And for the most part, when we look at the budgets, and General Manager Zagarek can chime in, the operating budgets tend to be fairly consistent through the years. So really, a lot of time what contributes that up and down in the budget is the 10-year capital forecast. So we do take the 10-year capital forecasts and overlay that on top of the operating budget as well. And that's how we get that black line. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, but then I'll have to ask Amber later on lots of other things.
I don't want to put Amber on the spot.
My next question through you, Chair, is slide 21. So I like the look of the annex results table. I like how it's shared alphabetically. I like looking at it from replacement value, average age. I like all of the colors. Why is this table not on our asset management website? I find that when I go to our website to try and understand, if I were to put myself as a resident that doesn't have the value and the benefit of this presentation, I think I'd like to see this particular slide because I want to be able to see how much red, how much green, how much yellow. So why is this not on our public-facing website?
It is there, but you're right, it's buried in the back of the report. I think that's something that we can definitely take back, and I think that's something that we can get on our website.
I think that this should be helpful with at least giving a very high-level view to community and to residents about the state of where our assets are currently. I see this, or I've actually been looking at other municipalities. Middlesex does a really good job. They use Microsoft Business Intelligence for theirs, and they pull out graphs and that sort of thing. And then there's tabs, you can just click on the tabs. Waterloo's is also just drop downs. So they've also got it like based on different areas, and then it's a drop down that just literally just says, what is the state? How much does it cost? It's a very simplified version. So when I go through our website, I find it really hard to navigate. So I'm hoping we can do a better user experience for the website. Thank you.
Next up, we have Councillor Cretch, followed by Councillor Cassar, then Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, and I hope this makes sense to ask now, and if not, Chair Nan, you can have me ask it later. But as I listened to the last presentation and this one, what I keep hearing, and this is a hard question to ask, so bear with me, it's probably for General Manager Zagirik. It seems like what we're doing is we're master planning, loading costs into the budget process, and then it's subject to political discussion at a point in time. And so city staff spend a tremendous amount of time figuring out what assets need to be renewed, doing a ton of work to classify and do some of the things that Amber and others have been talking about today. But then it comes down to a decision point that's not necessarily relevant to life cycles, the assets themselves, feedback from the community, and then a political decision is made based on either a multi-year or in-year budget or operating budget or tax budget. And it seems like that's a real weakness to the process. Could you talk about that a bit? Because I think what's happening from this perspective is we're not getting at the sort of beginning of a term of council. Here are the 41 assets we need to renew. Year by year, we have a presentation on Eastwood Arena, such and such a park. Like, we're not doing it in that way that's very direct. And so I'm trying to understand how these tools are all working together, because when I listen to what you're all saying, it seems like it's a recipe for political interference in a process that should be able to say delivering core assets that residents need.
Through the Deputy Mayor, I think this tool works well at the standing committee level, where committee members have the opportunity to probe and ask questions with respect to the programs and services, as well as any recommendations in terms of the level of investment required aligned with the program and services. I think where there's a bit of a rub to the process is through the budget process, when that now gets referred to the budget, and now in the context of the ability to pay as it relates to the financial requirements to support capital within the overall target or objective in terms of what the rate increase or tax increase is. And so I think that's a bit of the challenge, is as it relates to how information progresses to the budget process and then that tension. What we tried to do in 2025 is, when reports came to standing committees, we identified what the rate or levy impact would be, in the hope that maybe it would be further deliberated at the standing committee and not during the budget deliberations. Reflecting on this year, I think our experience has been similar to past years, is these are wants of a community, and as such are being referred to the budget process as a want of the community. And then again, that tension exists with respect to the budget process around the competing demands and needs relative to the ability to pay and what council ultimately chooses in terms of the rate and tax increase. I'm hoping
really
I answered the council's question.
In the very way you do. Thank you. I appreciate it. And through the chair, thanks for that explanation. I think where the rub is, and what I'm going to ask, I guess, everyone involved in this portfolio to think through is emergency and community services. Against my hopes for this term of council that every member of council would sit at every standing committee, that's not what's happening. And so we're getting a small group of folks who are sitting around the recreation assets table at a standing committee, and then ultimately this is all subject to a budget process. And again, the time cycles don't all line up for this, and we're not having wide conversations about our assets. What we're tending to do is have conversations about assets when they fail. So, or when they're nearing failure. And I understand this whole process is designed to avoid that in the future. So I guess what I'm saying is how we have those conversations, when we have them, and what assets we're focused on from an equity perspective are important. And that's my last question probably for the day, is about that. I think I'm not really hearing, the two things I'm not hearing loudly through the things. I've looked over the other presentation, the third one already in advance, and not hearing in a way that resounds or gives complete clarity to me is around equity. So I'm wondering if we could speak to that briefly, because it's not a regulation. It's not part of our financial budgeting system. Unfortunately, it won't be in this term of council either. So at a level where we're thinking about our asset management, can you someone speak to that? Or if it's going to be spoken to in the third presentation, I'll leave it for then.
Sorry, I don't think I heard quite the question. If you can repeat the...
Sure. The question's around equity and how equity is going to fit into this decision-making process, because we're talking about making plans for things based on asset quality. We're talking about life and a life cycle, these kinds of things, right? And planning for our future of our assets. What I'm kind of always trying to figure about these situations is we're going to always have competing assets, right? So there are always going to be some assets that come together at exactly the same time of need, right? So let's say we have 10 assets in the city. They're all, high cost assets. They all need to be replaced in a similar time period. How does an equity analysis inform what gets replaced first?
Okay, thank you for the clarity and for the question through the chair. We do have on the agenda this morning a concept around how we can look at equity and tying that into asset management. So I think that this question may be answered in part there. We're working on how to wrap our heads around and create an approach that addresses equity and embeds it in what we're doing. And I think what you will see later this morning is a really good start with a way that we could start to document and show transparency around an equity framework for asset management.
Sure. Before we get to that moment, last comment from me about that is, are you talking about specifically the third presentation? Because I looked in there and searched for keywords. I found equity about intergenerational equity on one of the slides, but I didn't see something. So I'm imagining that you're going to just talk that through more when we get there? Or do you mean the next 7.1C?
Sorry. I'm talking about the item C, 7.1C, which is corporate asset management equity update.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, next up we have Councillor Kassar.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just wanted to go back to slide 18 that Councillor Wang was asking about, and just to get some more clarity, I think, for public consumption, because I think this is a really important slide. And that was a slide that had the bar graphs from 2025 to 2054 and budgets. And Dan had referred to the blue line, which was the 10-year funding gap. I think the contrast on here isn't great, so I just want to confirm that the blue line is also the dashed line, which is just above the budget line. Just confirm from staff, please.
Thank you for the question. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, perfect. Just wanted to make sure that was clear. So then my actual question here is, and I believe I asked this back in the summer when this was presented, but I think it bears repeating, that this graph shows the budget and then above that the annual 10-year funding gap, which is the deficit. And the large bar that's shown in 2025 is the accumulated underfunding or the debt. So I just want to put a statement out there and just get confirmation, because I think this is really important for us and the public to understand. So with core assets, the plan over the next 10 years is to eliminate the deficit. So we're in a hole right now, and we're continuing to dig the hole every year with the deficit. And the plan is in 10 years for core assets, 25 for non-core, to stop digging the hole. We're still in a hole. And that's what's represented by that first bar in 2025 is the accumulated underfunding. So taking the example of core assets then, at 10 years into the plan, we'll have stopped digging a hole, but we'll still be in a hole that we're going to have to find a way to get out of somehow. So I just wanted staff to comment beyond that 10-year plan, what decisions are we making then? Because I think there's still a lot of tough decisions to make on how we're going to get out of that hole because we're still not meeting service levels the way they're defined today. So kind of high-level question, not specific to any category, but just generally, do I have that right? And how should we be thinking about that now with the decisions we'll be left with to make in 10 or 25 years?
Through the chair, we do answer a lot of this in presentation 3, so it's okay if we pause this question for now, and if I didn't clarify it in presentation 3, we can revisit it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just thought it was appropriate to put it out there given the graph and what it says, but happy to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Cooper, followed by Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question through you. So as we started to go through, and we saw about 8 boxes up there with different, I'll say, assessment criteria, 2 of which was around one was climate change, the other was life cycle. Do we evaluate those things mutually exclusively, or do we do that together and weave those things together? Is it assessment that, how does that work?
So we did them as sort of 2 separate processes. The climate change, climate adaptation, climate mitigation section of the asset management plan is really asking asset owners to think about how climate change may impact their assets and if there is a need to do something different into the future. And if so, what might those costs be? And then that would go into the life cycle management plan.
So my concern is that if you do climate change as a point in time, so if you look at emissions at a point in time, you're going to get a certain answer. If you take a life cycle approach and look at an asset from the creation of the resources that go into it all the way through to disposal, you get a very different answer, okay? So doing those things mutually exclusively, I'm not sure we're going to end up with the same answer as if we weave those 2 pieces together. So maybe we could go back, can we go back and look at that to see how that will change what we've come up in our report here?
Through the chair, the climate change framework was created for the first iteration of the asset management plan. We are intending to continuously improve that process. There are implications on levels of service due to climate change, but right now there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So you are correct, that is the ideal way to do it, but it was our first time doing it. So we created this framework, we looked at it mutually exclusively, but when we get a better handle on how climate change is going to impact our assets, we will incorporate that into the life cycle analysis.
Through you, Chair. So my concern is if we're going through and we're saying, here's how much this is going to cost us, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to iterate through it and start changing our approach around climate to a life cycle instead of a point in time, we're going to invest in assets that are going to give us, I'll use the phrase, wrong outcomes. And so I'm just interested in how we address this before we actually make the asset acquisition.
Through the chair, I think master plans also incorporate capacity increases as well, whereas our asset management plan is usually indicating replacement value like for like at this time. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to weigh in on this answer.
I think different assets require different evaluations. So, for example, the stormwater infrastructure would use design criteria based on particular storm events. And I don't have the specifics at my fingertips right now, but as the perhaps most obvious tangible example of climate change that we experience with our municipal infrastructure. And so the replacement of storm sewers is looked at differently now than it would have in the past. And so the review that we take on that is different and has changed. We have embedded in our capital projects and our investments, we have a climate lens that we look at for each project. So we're thinking about what are we doing to mitigate, what are we doing to consider adaptation. So we are evolving in this regard. I would say that's the right approach to take, is to continuously improve it, keep going, and intentionally learn as we go, so that we're making great decisions, good decisions, without bringing things to a stalled point. So I think that's the strategy we take. If that helps clarify.
Thank you. Thank you. Through you, Chair. I mean, my concern is we're talking about a $5.2 billion investment. This is huge dollars. And we're going to start investing in things where maybe we get 3 years down the road and we're thinking about things differently. I'm concerned about a like-for-like replacement. I mean, we should be looking at, asset rationalization. We should be using the proper methodology when it comes to climate. And, I don't think we can go forward with this without taking a step back and saying, are we doing it the right way? And if we're not, then I don't think we should proceed with this. I mean, these are big bucks. These are real taxes for our residents. And we're already hearing residents saying they're overtaxed. Now, if we come back and say, you know what, whoops, we made a mistake, that's not going to go well. I think what we have to do is we have to take a step back and just say, are we doing the right thing? And through you, Chair, I'm asking, can we pause this and reconsider asset rationalization and a life cycle approach when it comes to climate?
Through the chair, that's actually one of the themes in presentation 3, where we talk about the $5.2 billion gap and how we're not suggesting that you fund it fully immediately. So I do address rationalization in that presentation as well, and us trying to improve our data confidence around life cycle forecasts, which would incorporate that climate lens as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. A repeated theme, it would seem, if I could go back to Councillor Wang's kickoff question on this section. I think, in my opinion, in appreciating the importance of this information in informing our decisions, and to be sure, it is within the domain of an elected council to make ultimate decisions on timing, on levels of service, on rationalization, and it has forever been thus. What I'm hoping to better understand is the importation of this information such that I am held accountable for my decision, and that I'm making sure that my decision is informed by, I can discount it, but informed by outstanding debt and the deficit, if you will. So what I'm still struggling with is, how are we infusing our reports and our budget with this information in an ongoing way, so that, and I say this with the greatest respect, that I don't have to go dig for something in our asset management component of the web page, that it becomes part of my matrix, or in a report, it becomes embedded in those statements in a report. So it's there, and that helps inform my ordering of decision. Thank you.
The Deputy Mayor, specific to the financing plan in both the rate and the tax capital financing plan sections of the budget documents, there will be a outline with respect to how much of that financing plan is earmarked towards asset management and asset renewal. And then within each of the blocks, there'll be details of projects. I don't know that the projects will be compartmentalized as it relates to asset management or renewal. I would just suggest that the majority of the block funding is going towards asset management and renewal. That's just the nature of our capital financing and our block structure. So again, at a high level, the financing plan will identify how much of the proposed increase is towards asset management, and then within the capital detail sheets, there'll be a description of the projects that would align with the proposed funding.
I'm wondering, outside, for example, of a budget exercise, when we are in receipt of reports, and primarily from Public Works, but I would think increasingly from Recreation, that is there an opportunity for us to have a standing item embedded in those reports that enable us continuously to know where it sits, its condition, its funding? Like, I think that's what I think is necessary. I'm hearing a lot of questions about understanding the information, where to get the information, what informs a decision. And if we start from the premise that our capital assets are fundamental to upholding the integrity of community and in our service to community, I would hope to have a consistent reminder of the status of that in the reports. Probably not every report, but I would think in some reports that remind me of what is the condition, what is the level of service, where are the proposed funding sources, just so that I am constantly being held to that knowledge.
Thank you, Councillor. I think I understand it as a request for integrating this information into the key facts that are often in our committee reports so that it can be a factor of consideration for decision-making by committee members. Am I getting you right?
That is absolutely right, such that it doesn't become an appendix in a website, that it becomes part of our conditioning, that we have to be apprised of this. Whether we seek to discount it or not, it will be a political decision, but that it, exactly as you said it, Chair Nan.
Anybody want to respond? General Manager, thank you.
Through the Deputy Mayor, I'll start, and then I'll invite any other staff members to expand. I would suggest the Recreation report is a good demonstration, illustration of what Councillor Maureen Wilson is asking for. Within that report identified the state of recreation assets. As well, within that report identified what the financial requirements would be to support the proposed recommendations. So both of those pieces were included in that report as an example of what I'm hearing the councillor suggest would be helpful as it relates to each relevant report coming forward. So that's something we can take away and use as an example of best practice in terms of weaving in asset management and including the financial requirements to support the recommendations and have all of that under one cover.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Huang, as the previous Deputy Mayor, if I could, through you, just wanted to further clarify a question around the table and then see if I understood the response. And I appreciated it when it came forward in the form of an example. And that is under our current levels of service asset management plan content. So the 8 categories that are being integrated in. And climate change and life cycle management were raised. And I think about it from the perspective of, let's say, one of our facilities, our buildings. And when we think about it from the perspective of energy, and when we understand it from the lens of emissions, we know that our assets, our buildings, are contributing to the emissions in our community And as a municipality, we have an expressed target of contributing to reducing that. And so as we're reviewing an asset, what I'm assuming this process is going to do is be very clear and upfront about the investment that's needed either to take care of it from a renewal perspective, a repair perspective, or the potential of investing in a deep retrofit, for example. That costing analysis is done informed by that initial priority, which is, as a municipality, we are contributing to the reduction of emissions and being more energy efficient as a municipality, which we all know fiscally results in cost savings in terms of life cycle management. So can I just test that assumption against the example? Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate you articulating it with how it is tangible for you. The principles that you've described are consistent with approaches that we would take in any infrastructure upgrades or replacement or investment. So I think we are doing that, and perhaps the messaging is that communication of that more clearly would be helpful for council.
Through you, I have no further questions. That helps clarify. I'll take back the chair. There's no other speakers on the speakers list, so we'll move on to presentation number 3, which is additional clarification of our report findings. So over to Senior Program Analyst Dewar.
Okay, great. I'll try to go a little bit slower this time. Thank you for the feedback. So with respect to our presentation 3 agenda, so we're going to be going through our proposed levels of service asset management plan findings, which includes our summary of findings, more detail on the infrastructure funding gap, going a bit more into detail on our financial indicators and how they can be used. Then we'll just do a recap of our next steps for corporate asset management, so our schedule for asset management plan updates, our continuous improvement items, and then I'll have a brief conclusion as well. So this slide's going to look familiar. We did present it at the June 11th GIC, and this is our summary of findings. So when we look at our replacement value, we have a replacement value for all of our city assets at $39.4 billion, and we have that at our medium data confidence level, which, as we mentioned, is plus or minus 25%. We calculated our 10-year infrastructure funding gap at $5.2 billion, and we have that in our low to medium confidence, as we talked about as well, which is between 25 to 40% difference. And then, as Dan suggested, and when we looked at the life cycle management plan, if we take that $5.2 billion and we divide it by 10, that's annualized to $520 million per year to close that gap. So last time I presented on that slide, I showed the differences between what we calculated in our current levels of service plans and what we calculated this time around. And so I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail what the trends were and why we saw some of those changes. So for core assets, largely the reason why the funding gap changed was just due to inflation. Our previous core asset management plans used 2021 data. We've seen inflation increases of 10 to 20% for these assets, depending on the asset. From 2021 to 2024, and that really drove up our replacement values for core assets. So if we had something that was an unfunded need in 2021, it's gone up 10 to 20% just because of inflation. Another thing that we did between the last plans and the proposed plan was we improved our facility cost estimates. So if you reflect back to that figure I showed in presentation 1, where it's like these are all the things that are included in our life cycle needs, there were some needs that we were missing. We had labor costs incorporated as well as material costs, but we didn't have all of the soft costs, design costs, consultant costs associated with facilities. So we integrated that into our analysis, and that led to an increase across the board for many service areas areas because facilities are a service area that covers a lot of different areas. And so that resulted in a higher gap across many service areas, and a lot of those were in our non-core asset categories. But that said, we also saw some decreases to our reported funding gap. And the reasons for those were additional funding. So for an area, maybe the first time we saw it, we saw there were unfunded needs. Maybe more budget was allocated to that service area, and we saw that decrease happen. And we also saw decreases due to improved data confidence. And that's really what I'm trying to focus on in this presentation, and what we've kind of been talking about is if we improve our data confidence in a lot of cases, we also might see our gap decrease. Because right now we're using age-based estimates for many of our assets. We're not actually looking at them. We're saying, hey, we assumed a service life of 20 years, and we assume when it's at year 19 or year 21 that it's going to need to be replaced soon. Whereas if we actually look at that asset, we might say, hey, we thought it was 20 years, but actually we can push this out to 30 years, and now it's not in our 10-year forecast anymore. So when we look at the infrastructure funding gap changes, this is breaking it down by the individual service area. The blue bar is what we calculated more recently in 2025, and the orange bar is what we calculated last time. So as I mentioned, you can see some increases and some decreases here, and I'm not going to go through one by one, but if there are specific questions, we can go to that individual service area during the Q&A, but I did give you the trends. The one I do want you to focus on, though, is if we look at engineered structures, this is a really good example of what I was just talking about. So when we initially did the gap, we saw an $80 million infrastructure funding gap, but when we actually used condition information as opposed to age information, we actually saw that go down to $8 million. So again, this is us really just saying if we improve our data confidence, we might see the gap decrease. The other thing I want to contextualize when we think about the infrastructure funding gap is this isn't just something that built up over the last few years. Our infrastructure position represents a huge social investment that has progressively built up over decades, and that's due to historic funding. We are an older municipality. We're over 150 years old. We have many assets, and we've acquired assets at different times, had those peaks, as Dan showed in his age profile, and some of those are coming up for renewal. So a lot of the time, when we're looking at this infrastructure funding gap, we're looking at assets beyond their estimated useful lives, which, as we've said, is a lower data confidence. We're looking at assets in poor or very poor condition. Those are ones we have eyes on. And we're also looking at our backlog of facility maintenance needs, and we're getting those from our building condition assessment information. So showing this figure again, and I'm going to go through it again just because I know this is a figure that's kind of difficult to understand at first. So when we think about our life cycle needs, those are the colored bars on the graph. And as Dan was saying, anytime you see the colored bar exceed that black line, that's when it's going into the infrastructure funding gap. So the colored bars are our life cycle needs, the black line is the budget, and the dashed line is if we take everything that's exceeding the needs and we divide it over 10, that's how much it would cost to fund all of those needs over 10 years. But the part I really want you to focus on for this specific slide is year one, and that's what Dan focused on as well. This is the backlog of needs. This is the stuff that's built up over time. This is the stuff that was due maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or stuff that's been identified to be in very poor or poor condition. So that's basically our historic underfunding. That's the largest driver of our $5.2 billion funding gap. But I just want to be clear with this. We are not suggesting you fully fund $5.2 billion immediately. And for the following 3 reasons. So one, I keep talking about data confidence. So our funding gap has a low to medium data confidence, and that really indicates that as we continue this asset management work, the gap will change significantly over time. It might decrease, as I suggested, or we might go out and look at some assets and it might increase in some areas as well. But we want to get a better handle on this data confidence before we start saying, hey, let's fund this amount of money. The other piece of this is, we've already talked about this and you're hearing this in budget all the time. If their tax levy were increased at the identified rate, we're going to see tax rates be unaffordable to many of our customers. So we really need to consider this when we're thinking about increasing funds. Is this going to be affordable to our customers? And then the last piece is, even if we had all the money, if we found everything, it's going to be difficult to coordinate all of those activities to close the funding gap over a 10-year period. So this is an area where maybe we can find some efficiencies with some projects, but at the same time, if we wanted to close the funding gap for roads in that short period of time, we'd have to rip up a lot of roads. It would be a transportation network nightmare. It's not something that we're looking to do. So you're going to be asking, well, what are you asking me to do? And that's sort of the remaining part of this presentation. So going back to our first presentation, asset management is about balancing cost, risk, and performance to deliver an agreed level of service. The infrastructure funding gap that we're presenting serves as an indicator of the magnitude of the city's long-term capital pressures and funding shortfall. So we know it's in the billions. We know that that's the magnitude of it. We have a confidence of 25 to 40%. It might be $3 billion, it might be $7 billion. We know that it's a lot of money. So this amount is going to inform our balanced approach between affordability, performance, and risk to achieve sustainable service levels, while also considering intergenerational equity. With respect to our financial strategy to date, as my General Manager Zagarek said, as indicated in the 2025 tax budget, they did provide additional funds for asset management plans. So for transportation, we have additional funds for over 10 years. For non-core assets, we're seeing it over the 25 years. And we also have additional rate funds for Hamilton Water assets as well. The $5.2 billion calculation that we have today does incorporate those increases where the budget was formally allocated. So that budget item that you see in your budget, if that was not to be allocated, we will see our infrastructure funding gap estimate increase. And as we know, failure to address the funding gap appropriately is expected to contribute to an increase in costly reactive maintenance activities and a decline in service levels citywide as assets continue to deteriorate. So as I said, I'm not suggesting that we fund the $5.2 billion gap immediately, but there are some funds that we know are going to be required because we know the magnitude of this gap is so big. However, there are other gap management strategies, and this is what I want to emphasize today. There are infrastructure funding gap strategies other than additional funding. So the first one is we can prioritize our life cycle activities, and we do this. So we may have to defer some of our activities, and that's going to require effective prioritization techniques, and we're going to have to consider things like risk and our appetite for risk across the city. That's an improvement area for us. We're going to look at increasing data confidence. So again, this is a theme I've been talking about. We need to mature in our asset management practices to improve our confidence in our life cycle needs forecasts to get a better handle on that gap number. And then some questions that we had previously, disposing or closing of underutilized assets. That's a great option. Some of our assets might be underutilized, they might not provide as much value as others, and they may be candidates for disposal or optimization, so we have to look at those. We can also look at reducing our expected levels of service, and a lot of people don't want to do that, but thinking about it, some of our assets could be overperforming, customers might not see value in some of the levels of service we're providing, and we really need to get a handle on what those are because those might be cost savings for us for the city as well. And then the last one here, increasing funding allocations. So we've already done that a little bit. So what we're suggesting is, let's try some of these other options before we increase our funding allocations too much. And that will give us a better idea of where the funding should go. In terms of our current approach, so how we prioritize across the city, so prioritization is currently completed based on funding block allocations. And as I mentioned in presentation 1, improvements to this process are going to require those multiple systems. So EAM, Enterprise Resource Management System, these are all currently in progress, and these are going to really help us here. Increasing data confidence, I'm going to go more later in the presentation, but that's really our focus in corporate asset management, and we have initiated that work. Now, when we look at disposing of assets or reducing expected levels of service, these are service area specific. Staff do bring reports to council for these decisions periodically. They're going to be service area to service area, but future targeted investigations for this could be beneficial. And then the last one, I already spoke to this a bit, but increasing funding allocations is likely going to have to happen, but it is partially complete at this point with our asset management financial strategy, and we should reinvestigate this after we've exhausted some of these other options. Now, switching gears a bit on how you can use the asset management plan for decision making. So we had some questions last time on financial indicators. And as I mentioned, when we're doing the asset management plan, we're kind of looking at all of our services together. There's a lot of information, and so we've rolled it up service area to service area. So the blue bar on this figure is our 10-year asset renewal funding ratio, and the orange bar is our 10-year operations maintenance and renewal ratio. So if we've color-coded it a bit for better navigation. So if you look look at the blue area, if both of these bars are in the blue, we can say that the service is likely well-funded, the service is sustainable over time. If we're seeing a lot in the orange, we're saying, hey, this is below target, but it might not take too much to get it to target if we allocate additional funding. And if we're going to the pink, we're seeing, hey, you know what, these look like they might be underfunded. These might be areas where I want to investigate a little bit further. We have provided the heat map here as well, which gives you an idea, sort of high level, where that sustainability would come from if you're reading the graph, just so you can see sort of like, oh, if I have a line in blue and a line in pink, what does that mean? So that said, where known, the significant drivers for the ratio outputs are identified in the individual service area sections in the proposed levels of service asset management plan. So what we suggest you do is you look at this graph, say, I want to look at this service area a little bit further. You open the proposed levels of service asset management plan and you navigate to that section and say, is this a project, this is the driver, is this a project that I want to fund, or are there other options to fund this, this gap piece? And switching gears again, this is where we start talking about the next steps for corporate asset management. So our schedule for asset management plan updates. So the next plans you're going to see are the core plans. So that's going to be 2026 and 2027, and we're going to embed a lot of the continuous improvement items we've been working on into those. And we're also going to do a little bit more work on what we call our unallocated assets, and that includes our leased assets. So right now we have leased assets incorporated as part of our replacement value, but we don't necessarily have them incorporated as part of the infrastructure funding gap. We also don't have a lot of the assets that aren't public facing in our gap as well. So those are things we're going to look at, and they're going to be encompassed as well in the 2026 to 2027 timeframe. And then with respect to continuous improvement, these are our priorities for corporate asset management at the moment. We're looking at asset data improvements, so completing inventories and condition assessments, especially for assets that are significant and have low data confidence. That will help us target the backlog of unfunded needs, and that will help us improve the confidence of the funding gap. We also want to look at improving our life cycle activity documentation. That goes with climate change as well. We need to improve our asset needs forecasts, what are required to maintain current levels of service, and improve confidence with that forecasting ability. And that will also help with some of the questions we've had on new acquisitions. It helps us understand, if we acquire this new asset, what are going to be the ongoing operating impacts for this asset, and helps us make those decisions a little bit better. And then the last piece we want to work on, we talk about how asset management is about levels of service. We are looking at making improvements to these levels of service as well. We want to make sure we're refining them to ensure we're measuring the right information to effectively monitor performance. And we've already started doing that through a municipal scan. And we also want to start looking at adjusting our existing targets to reflect those levels of service that customers both want and are willing to pay for. And that's going to be done through public engagement as well. So those are some of our continuous improvement items. So lastly, just want to conclude. So as we've talked about, asset management is a journey. And as you can see, we have made significant progress over the last 4 years. And we've really been focused on, at this point, OREG 58817 compliance. We are, as a city, collectively working towards the evidence-based decision-making that we think would be valuable. And that's occurring through the development of those multiple tools. And those are in progress. And our current focus, as I just mentioned, is on improving data confidence so that the inputs to these tools will be as accurate as possible, and so we can get a better handle on that infrastructure funding gap number of what actually does require additional funding. So in the interim, I'm hoping that the data we've compiled for you so far provides that guiding information that can be used by both staff and council for the 2026 budget process. Thank you so much. And I just also want to extend a thank you to everyone who was involved with writing the proposed levels of service asset management plans. We did have 26 service areas across the city, and so I just want to thank all the general managers, directors, managers, supervisors, and staff involved. It was compiling a lot of information. It wasn't just our team. It was a lot of groups across the city, so thank you so much to those folks who were involved. And I will stop the presentation for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And to no surprise, first up on the docket is Councillor Wayne.
I get excited about this stuff. Amber, thank you for that presentation. Help me reconcile slide 5 and slide 13. So slide 5 is the big bar chart one that actually has all of the service areas, but at the very top it says City Housing Hamilton, where the gap is, the big blue line is double the size of the orange line. And then when we go to slide 13, City Housing Hamilton is number 2 on that list, but the orange line is 80% longer than the blue line. So I don't understand these two slides because they don't seem to talk the same language. So can you help me with understanding these two charts?
Through the chair, Dan Leake's going to answer that question. I think he's just trying to open the slides up.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Through the chair. So the City Housing Hamilton, what you're looking at on the one slide is the gap only. So that's really where we've identified the gap. And specifically to City Housing Hamilton, that change in funding gap is really tied to the facility replacement costs and that change that Amber spoke about. And City Housing Hamilton, at this point in time, they are redoing all their building condition assessments. And so we expect that this will change once they get updated building condition assessment data. And the other challenge with City Housing Hamilton as it relates to the gap is that they do have some renewal plans. However, those renewal plans are not necessarily public at this point in time. And so we're not able to incorporate those plans into their future budgets, et cetera, because those plans are, for obvious reasons, because it's real estate transactions, it's people's homes. Those plans usually aren't divulged, as I understand, until they're ready to make those announcements. So that does contribute to that gap a little bit. So that's some of the drivers behind the change in that gap. Okay. Going down to...
Let's say road linear then. Let's look at road linear. Sorry, Chair, I'm just gonna just take a lot more into this, but because when we look at road linear, we know that there is a massive infrastructure gap there. However, when we look at slide 13 and we look at road linear, it's kind of buried in the almost to the below target yellow range, but it's actually, but if you look at the orange versus the blue, it's 50%. Like, so I think I just need to understand in really simple layman's terms the differences between these two slides, because it's showing that the infrastructure gap, yes, that's the current state, but then my slide 13 tells me that the financial indicators say that it's out of whack with what slide 5 was saying. So I'm just trying to reconcile what are these two charts telling me.
Through the chair, they are two different charts. And so in layman's terms, the first one you're looking at is just the dollar value. So roads are a very expensive asset, so they're going to be showing near the top. It's saying the magnitude of roads linear is huge. When we look at the other chart, this is a ratio. So this is the budget that we have for that service area divided by the needs that we have. So roads has a big budget, but they also have a big need. And so we do that division, it falls lower on the list. So what financial indicators do is they're making it a ratio between the needs and the budget versus the other graph is saying this is how big each of them is, right? So that's why a lot of the times with these graphs, it's not saying let's put money towards the area with the biggest gap. It's saying let's look at the area that has the ratio that is maybe the lowest, and that's what you're seeing in this figure. So we are still seeing roads linear in an area where we're saying that they are significantly below target, but it's not the lowest funded when we look at ratio between budget and needs across the city. I hope that's clearer.
It's clearer, yes. And then what's super interesting to see tourism and culture at the top of that list, meaning that the ratio is the largest. Meanwhile, because there's not a ton of infrastructure, it's the lowest on slide 5. So again, that's where I was trying to understand how the rankings worked and that sort of thing. Because as a decision maker, if I look at slide 13 as the financial indicators, what we're saying is we're not putting as much money into tourism and culture versus Hamilton Street Railway, where we're putting, it's almost even, and it's well-funded and that sort of thing, right? But we also know that with our 10-year transit strategy, the HSR now, that's also going to affect the financial indicators because this is a point in time, it's not going to be reflected. Is that correct then?
Yes, through the chair, basically this graph, it's not meant to be read like you need to fund the top one. It's meant to be read, I want to look at this a little bit more. I'm going to open that section of the plan and say, do I agree that the areas that are causing these ratios to be low should be funded? So like for tourism and culture, we are seeing, one of the buildings is in poor condition. We're saying, maybe that building should be renewed. but maybe the decision could be we're going to complete the minimum activities required to get it to fair condition, right? So that assumption can change, and the asset owners would bring forward those projects during the budget process.
Thank you for that. That is a lot more clearer to me. Switching tacks and switching topics a little bit, getting back to some of the gap management strategies that you had outlined, the ideas on slide 11 and 12, where we talk about the reducing the expected levels of service and disposing or closing of underutilized assets. I get that for the vast majority, a lot of this might be staff driven, where they might tell us what could happen here. This gets back to my question from presentation number 1, which is, how do we incorporate the community voice, or how do we have that, how is that weighted in order for us to make a decision on these, especially when we talk about the reduction of expected levels of service or the potential disposition or closing of specific assets? Because I think that those will, as a councillor, I have to take into significant account what the community is saying. Like, the community's, even, let's just say Pat Quinn Arena is underutilized. The staff are saying that we want to close Pat Quinn Arena, or we want to reclassify it or reduce the expected level of service. However, as a councillor, I know Pat Quinn Arena is well used. So how do we add that into the decision-making matrix moving forward as we talk about this from a gap management perspective?
Through the chair, we do have surveys in our current levels of service plans, and they kind of give trends overall. So they'll say arenas. They won't say specifically Pat Quinn Arena, but it will give us an idea of what customers are expecting if they think we're performing well in these areas. When we look asset to asset specific, we do lean on the service areas a bit, and service areas are doing their own surveys. So they do their surveys as part of the master plan exercise, and through that, that should give you a little bit more context. So ideally, when staff are bringing something forward, they have a survey already, and they're bringing you those recommendations with the information they have collected as well when they're bringing forward those recommendations. That said, as Dan suggested, we are working on improving our public engagement in our corporate asset management division, and that's something we're going to work on for the next plans as well.
Thank you. I truly appreciate that. My concern is that, as we saw this first time around, we didn't get very high user engagement when it came to just this asset management. I know my office was pushing it because I have a vested interest in the asset management planning, but we still didn't get a lot of Ward 4 residents that understood, cared, or really was cognizant enough to understand what they were participating in, because this is such an important aspect to how we make decisions, but that it's lost in translation here. So I'm hoping that we can look at revamping our public-facing page, give it a much more simplified user experience. Don't expect that the customer is going to dig through all of these documents, especially the 478 pages, to find one chart that has the red, yellow, green on it. So I think that if we can really help with simplifying the information and making it a little more user-friendly, then that will be helpful as we have better community engagement moving forward. So that's my sort of ask, if we can do it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor, next up we have Councillor Kazar.
Thank you very much, Chair. And the first time, 2 times I spoke, I didn't express my thanks to the asset management team and everyone else involved. So just jumping off the final slide there. Thank you very much. It's a huge topic, very, very important, and really appreciate it. I think maybe I made a comment back in June that led to a motion that got us here because I'm so excited about the topic and how important it is. So my apologies, or you're welcome, depending on your perspective. Just building off of what Councillor Wang was asking about on slide 13, showing the financial indicators, which are the ratios. So understand the answer that was given and what this is showing. So through you, Chair, my question has to do with how we've gotten to very different funding ratios by areas. And I understand that's accumulated over time. But we're at a point in time now where, and I understand that this is not reflective of the magnitude of spending in each area. It's just the funding ratio relative to the funding required. So how do I phrase this? There's priorities that staff reporting in each of these areas have made decisions made based on priorities and past council decisions that have got us to this point. In some cases here, the funding ratio is in a really good spot, at or better than where we need to be, and some are well below. So how, and is there a part of the process, and I think it was touched on, but I want to dig in a little deeper, is how do we recalibrate that, or is there a way to recalibrate that? Is there a recommendation to recalibrate that to determine that an investment in something that is very underfunded, according to this chart, actually could have benefit and multiples of benefit compared to the funding that's much higher in something else? Because to have a whole bunch of things that are really underfunded and then some that are at or over, it's unbalanced just at a high level and not speaking to any particular areas, whereas a different approach, and I understand it's not practical, but funding everything to the same ratio, is a very different approach. And I get that that's not a realistic way to shift gears, but is there opportunities through the budget process or over time to make decisions on recalibrating where the money is coming because of the priorities and benefits to the city overall? Long-winded question, but I hope that's clear. Just as a perspective, it's not a detailed answer, but is that considered, and is there opportunity in the future?
Through the deputy mayor, I saw everyone turn to me, so I'm assuming this is my question. Short answer is yes. It's a requirement for us to go through the exercise of resetting, recalibrating our funding relative to the needs and means of the various asset groups. In terms of timing, I don't have an answer today in terms of how we'll embark on that. I'll just refer to that chart, because that chart, for someone who's familiar with over time what might have contributed to these ratios and these gaps, is at the top end of that chart, many of those services do not have blocks, capital funding blocks, nor do they have reserves. At the bottom end of that chart, many of those services have capital funding blocks, allocations. In the case of HSR, as an example, it has provincial gas tax revenue sharing, just short of, I believe, 12 million annually towards capital and operating. They have dedicated reserves towards the replacement of assets. And so we need to look at recalibrating, resetting the funding relative to the information that the asset management team and the organization as a whole have compiled. And that will mean some resetting of blocks, which may represent a bit of a challenge in terms of for the organization to pivot and change, recognizing if there's some resetting of capital funding, the organization structurally needs to change for that. And so short answer is it's necessary to recalibrate, and I expect we will continue to identify opportunities how to leverage this information to inform that recalibration, and some potential timelines for that as well.
Thank you, through you, Chair. It's really helpful, and it's kind of building on what Councilor Maureen Wilson was saying earlier. It's really important for staff to be able to provide those opportunities, and it's up to this body to be aware of that information, use it, discount it, and maybe make different decisions, because when we don't have enough money over such a long period of time, there are tough decisions that need to be made. And to what Councillor Cooper was talking about, rationalization, at some point, I think that becomes a real decision point. And just kind of building off of that, and slide 16, one of the comments in there is about what residents and taxpayers are willing to pay for. So it would seem to me, and this, I'm just looking for confirmation that over time, as we're in a deficit, willing to pay for, I think that generally doesn't change as we expect a service level, and this is how much money we have, and we're willing to pay that. But as things deteriorate, it costs more to provide the same level of service. And that was in the previous presentation, I think, is just to maintain service levels, we need to invest in resources, invest in capital. So at some point, the willing to pay for isn't enough to maintain current service levels. So I just want to make sure I think that concept is correct, and that's kind of the crux of what we're dealing with, is we have an expectation today, tomorrow, that's going to be a little tougher to maintain, the next day tougher to maintain it over time. I mean, we're seeing that now with our roads as the most obvious example that gets reported on. So I'm just looking for confirmation, putting it out there that I think that's what we're dealing with, and this only gets tougher over time without a huge fundamental shift in how we're funded or a change in service levels. So through you, Chair, if I could just think a confirmation.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's just important to put that out there to articulate what we're dealing with, and there are really difficult things we're going to have to deal with, and affordability is so important, and balancing that. And I don't like to use the word balance because it feels like it's trying to do two things, and you can never be great at two things all the time. But anyway, I just wanted to express that, and I don't have any further questions.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Crutch.
My question will be really brief. It's not even a question, pardon me. It's more about sort of plus oneing what Councillor Huang was saying about clarity. And when I looked at this specific presentation, I saw core and non-core assets. And I started thinking about how that translates to residents and what they understand that to mean. And so I think it's really important that when we're looking at things like master plans and looking at language like master plan, looking at language around core assets and asset management, that we do break it down in a bit more of a simplified way for folks, because I feel like it's not really clear to the average person what our assets are. And I don't think that word in itself is helpful for the public, because that's not what they, generally speaking, in my understanding, think of an asset as. And everyone's going to approach that from a different perspective. And so how we communicate this about, for instance, the cycle you have might be a better way of doing it, right? So you have something like, we're going to replace something. We're going to, a replacement of our assets in this category might be a way of phrasing it. So I'm just looking to see if that can be something that's really incorporated in the public-facing documents, and frankly, documents facing council as well. So I think all documents we share here have to be as legible as possible and as clear as possible. We're receiving thousands and thousands of pages on this subject over the course of a term of council, and the clearer it is for everybody about what the activity is that we're doing today, the activity is we're doing tomorrow, and then what we're seeing in the future is really important. So I just wanted to echo that and thank Councillor Huang for her comments.
Great, and that exhausts our speakers list. Okay, so thank you again for, Councillor Pauls on this last presentation.
Yes, I'm also the report on financial indicators. I was really shocked that the Hamilton Police Service is below funded. It's the third. And that I love the paramedics and the fire, they're well, but we always talk how much the police is the highest budget line. I'm wondering, is this an indicator that it is not? I just want to be clear. I don't understand that chart.
Through the chair, that's a valid question. The reason why the ratio is low on that is largely due to the renewal of Central Station. So that's a decision that needs to be made by this council of if that's going to be renewed or not, but it is making the ratios lower. So you are correct, Hamilton Police does get a substantial budget, but it's really just this one renewal item. And that's what I mean when you look at these financial indicators, you need to go to the section and say, what do I think we need to do about this key driver?
Yeah, that's so important about our downtown station. It really needs a new one. So, okay, I just wanted to be clear that every time I hear that, our asset we too much for the police, I see it right on top. So I wanted to be clear what it says. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pauls. Are any other first-time speakers? Seeing none, then thank you for the presentations, all three of them, for all the work that went into preparing them and clarifying fulfilling the request that came previously to get these presentations forward. At this point, what we need is a mover and seconder to receive the presentations. Nope, I'm wrong.
Deputy Mayor, we have one more presentation, so we were going to receive everything in combination at the end. So that was the presentations for 7.1A. I believe we still have 7.1C, and then following that, we were going to receive.
You're right, I'm wrong.
Sorry.
Okay, over to 7.1C, which is our corporate asset management equity update.
Thank you, Chair. So we also wanted to come and bring you an update on equity and asset management as part of today's meeting. So we're going to just go back to the definition of equity at the City of Hamilton. I'm going to go back to the Phase 1 work that we've done already, our equity matrix, and then I'll talk about what we're planning to do for Phase 2. So equity is really, it doesn't mean treating people the same. It's really about creating a level playing field and how we aim to remove unjust disadvantages. And it's really the question is, how do we build that into our asset management work and planning as a city? So when we look at equity and asset management, we really want to embed equity into a data-driven infrastructure planning process to understand where and how to level the playing field related to the services we provide, and then really what assets do we need to support that service. We also realize that equity considerations are a component of prioritization and need to also be considered along with other factors and the rationale of how we select projects, i.e. safety, environmental constraints, affordability, risk, etc. And as a city, we're doing a lot of equity-focused work already. For our equity matrix Phase 1, which we presented at GIC on March 19th, we did ask staff to engage citywide for completion of our equity matrix exercise, where we considered equity by major asset category or service area. And we asked asset owners to consider their services from a range of possible equity perspectives. How does their service and assets impact people with different ability, different age groups, different means, different race, gender, or indigenous identity? And then we also did ask asset owners to generate a summary of their existing programs that do integrate equity, and we presented that in the March 19th GIC. So we saw that as a starting point for equity workshops with asset owners as part of the next asset management plan updates over the next several years. It was a way to start the conversation with asset owners. Asset owners may also consider developing some equity-based levels of service. And we also saw that as a tool for asset owners as part of their work to start to bring equity into the 2026 budget process and guidelines. Again, outlining an inventory of their existing equity programs and starting to think about how those impacts, about how their services and assets may impact people from different groups' perspectives. So that brings us to what's next. So for Phase 2, corporate asset management is looking to pilot the development of a data-driven, place-based tool to integrate equity considerations into asset management decision-making using some geospatial mapping. And we think this will help us answer the who and the where questions. We hope to identify an overall neighborhood equity score by census area using available data to identify areas ranging from strong equity concern to no equity concerns. These are typically developed using multi-agency approach with experts in statistics, GIS, and robust technical documentation on what variables were used and weighted to identify areas of more or less equity. That would be the next iteration for us. For now, though, we're going to draw on naturally recognized and locally adapted equity methodologies to build our internal CAM pilot approach. There are many cities already doing this. The City of Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary, and Metro Vancouver all have similar neighborhood equity indices. A lot of them devolve from the World Health Organization process, but then customized to a local municipal context. The provincial government has some mapping in this area already with the Ontario Marginalization Index, and that was actually used in the equity and road classification analysis that was done along with some other factors. The Recreation Master Plan had an equity analysis as well. And going back to 2023, the City of Hamilton Parks Master Plan also had some equity considerations, which they looked at focus factors from a geographical perspective on how they plan and situate parks. So we did a comparison of these tools, and you can see there's a wide variety in how these tools are developed and implemented. The City of Calgary considers over 60 unique indicators in their neighborhood equity index, all the way down to Toronto looking at less than 20. Ottawa is currently sitting at about 27 individual indicators in their scoring. And these indicators cross a number of policy domains. So they look at social and human development, the physical environment, the health, governance, and economic opportunity, basically by census areas. As part of our comparison, we also looked at the equity domains. And so I know this graph is very busy, but it is in your reports. So you can see largely the policy domains and then the subcategory of those domains. And then going from left to right, you can see the individual plans that we looked at, as well as the percentage that those individual indicators go into those sub-policy domains. I'm going to just step back to Ottawa for a moment. So Ottawa originally developed their neighborhood equity mapping with the Social Planning Council of Ottawa in 2019. And in 2022, they actually undertook a renewal of their approach, realizing that they needed to grow and develop. So that took almost 2 years. And in 2024, they developed some additional indicators, they changed some indicators, and they also developed a split for urban and rural, recognizing that some of the distances may be more significant in rural areas than urban areas. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I guess that would be, yeah, you're right. You'll see that there are the domains and the indicators that Ottawa is considering. And Ottawa's put all their data online. So they have a GIS-powered dashboard along with Power BI dashboards. And you can look at the individual domains, i.e. selecting the tabs across the top will take you to the different economic opportunities, social human development opportunities, and they have accumulated an overall neighborhood equity index score using statistical methodology on how to weight the different factors. So they've got this public-facing GIS database, which is quite interesting. The link is there on the bottom if that's something that is of interest. So just for a really high-level conceptual example, we took the Ontario marginalization data that's already out there, and you can see all we did was sum the individual marginalization scores from 0 to 5 across the Ontario marginalization domains. We didn't do any weighting to it, we just mapped it to see what it would look like. So this is really just a high-level conceptual example of existing data that's already out there for the Ontario Marginalization Index, ranking neighborhoods from very likely to be marginalized to very unlikely to be marginalized. So if we have that mapping, then we can actually overlay our existing GIS condition data, location data, how our assets are distributed across the city and the condition of those assets. And then we can actually just ask ourselves questions. You know, is this the distribution I expected? If it is or it isn't, should we change the distribution? If we did, how would we change the distribution? Do we need to consult with any groups or personnel? And how does this affect our overall project prioritization of all the other work that we need to do? And then if we answer that we do want to make a change, how would we do that work and then fund that change? So these are really just about identifying areas where we can ask questions to ourselves, and then that could influence our future plans. So just some possible ones we could investigate. We could look at sidewalk condition by neighborhood equity index. We could look at how far it is to get to a public water fountain. We could look at where the water fountains are. We could look at road condition. We could look at how many roads have sidewalks versus how many roads don't have sidewalks. We could look at our distribution of public art or horticultural beds. And we could look at the condition of overall city facilities by area. These are some of the things that we could look at. So our next steps on how we do this is we're going to pilot a Hamilton neighborhood place-based equity tool. We're looking to acquire the data that's already underway. A lot of the data is actually Statistics Canada data or data available from our public health or police services. We're going to undertake a data analysis and validation. We want to populate the equity index by neighborhood, develop that GIS-based tool, ideally linking to some online dashboards, train internal users on the tool, use it internally as a pilot and see how it works, see what results it gets. And then we want to gather feedback for improvement as we evolve the tool. So that's how we plan to embed equity into asset management planning processes across the city, if there's any questions.
Yep, first up we have Councillor Crutch. So just take a moment, Councillor, as Dan is moving back to a seat. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks very much. My questions are about sort of one of the slides that talked about some of the questions we can ask. So some of the questions that asset owners can start asking. And I guess what I was wondering is what part of the process we're in with respect to those questions being asked, and when we're going to have sort of a final analysis or some semi-final analysis of the answers to those questions and begin to settle on a disposition with respect to scoring and those kinds of things, because there's multiple choices, obviously.
Thank you for the question. So we're looking to build the tool and then see some of those questions and see how we get those answers. As corporate asset management, we would ideally work with asset owners through their asset management planning process over the next couple of years to answer those questions. But as the tool becomes available, asset owners could start to ask those questions themselves as they prepare their master plans, as they prepare their in-year budgets. I'm not sure if anyone from the bench has any more to add to that.
That makes sense to me. Thanks so much. I think what I'm very interested in is understanding which direction we're going to go in, because these different tools have different weightings for how they understand demographics, health, other kinds of outcomes. And I'm also interested in not just focusing on asset owners, but the gaps in assets. The best example to make this clear to everybody else listening is public washrooms. So there are no asset owners for public washrooms, they don't exist. So how do we deal with a situation like that where this isn't just about assets that already exist or core things we're already doing, but the future of what downtowns look like with respect to places like public washrooms and how we understand where we need to have more of those and less of those. And how does that conversation happen if there's not necessarily an asset owner for something that exists? Do we have asset owners for things that don't exist or things we're planning to do? So just want to understand that a bit better.
Okay. Hello. Thanks for the question. I'm being looked at to take a shot at answering this one, so I'll do my best. I think those are questions that that this kind of tool development can be answered in the future when we have it. So the power of this concept of this tool is that we would be able to look at with a geo-reference what the different parameters are, what the different drivers are, and then have dialogue with some meaningful data to backstop it about what if. So in the context of public washrooms, what if we wanted to put them in certain locations? And then I think, I'm not the technical wizard on this kind of thing, but I think we could add a layer that would look at something like that. But I'll maybe bounce that back to Dan to clarify if that's correct.
To the chair, thank you. Yeah, I think, once we have this tool in place, we could start to even ask those questions about what services are we not providing, and then this becomes part of the prioritization analysis of, well, then where should we provide those services, and how does that neighborhood, is that neighborhood one where we should consider a different priority level for that service over another neighborhood?
Thanks. And so that was my last question, actually, was focusing on the areas and spaces geospatially that you're targeting. So for instance, when you look at some of the other tools, they look at census tracts, some look at neighborhoods, others look at broader areas. Are we going to be able to get down to smaller subsections and streets and those kinds of things? The reason I ask is because in a downtown core, which is very dense, those larger tracks may not have the same meaning as they'd have in an area where the density is much less, right? So I'm trying to understand if we're going to be able to have information so that, for instance, when there are maybe a cluster of seniors buildings in an area, right? And we're thinking about infrastructure for sidewalk replacement. And we know that bad sidewalk infrastructure isolates seniors and disproportionately, keeps them from being able to access municipal services. Then we make a decision with the proper kind of index or information to say, okay, this is a decision here, or do we have to do that work later on? I guess I'm just asking if that could be maybe a consideration as part of this, is how detailed the information gets based on population density. Is that something you're thinking about?
One advantage to using the census blocks is that they're largely the same size populations. A higher density block would have a smaller size and a less dense block would have a larger size. So it is a way to incorporate population into the analysis.
Right, so that your focus is going to be on those. I would also say we're lucky we lucked out. Hamilton did ask the federal government to use ward level statistics as well for our census tract information. So we actually have that GIS data available to us because we opted into that program. So just as a comment or suggestion for me that whatever we do here, we also layer in the wards as well so we can see what the data looks like ward by ward. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Cretch. Second time, Councillor Huang.
First time, Councillor Huang.
First time, second speaker.
Thank you. I don't envy you guys because this is a ton of things to think about, especially this term of council. We've talked about gender-based safety audit, which looks at everything from a gendered lens. We look at it from a carbon-based budgeting lens with climate change. We've also looked at equity indexes. We're looking now at this neighborhood level. How do you envision best incorporating all of these different lenses? Because at this point, it might be a little bit of a kaleidoscope, and then it's hard for a kaleidoscope to zoom in on anything. So how do you plan on doing this? Because I understand that the Ottawa one, which is a very good first start, but I'd worry about downtown revitalization. Like, how do we start to incorporate downtown revitalization in addition to some of the, again, safety or any of that stuff? So I don't know. This is why I'm inquiring minds want to know.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. And I think that's kind of what we touch on, that this is a component of prioritization. So this is another piece of information into the mix, but it's not the only piece of information to consider when we get down to the project level. What projects do we choose? How do we choose those projects? Why are we choosing those projects? But it is another piece to the puzzle. And that's something that we do have to do work on, is what is the prioritization and how do we come up with that weighting? Because there are other considerations for projects that we do. There's environmental considerations, there's risk considerations, there's capacity considerations. There's a lot of variables that go into the selection of the projects and services that we do provide. But this just helps identify another piece that could be used in that prioritization.
Okay. So then my second question is the next steps then, because I do see your next steps, which is piloting this NEI tool, but we don't have Power BI dashboards yet, and so that feels like you're putting the cart ahead of the horse. So what's the actual sort of step-by-step moving forward?
So step one would be to build it. We've already, as I said, collected a bunch of the data points. Largely, we're looking at the Ottawa model. There's actually really, there's a robust technical guide on how Ottawa did it, the statistical methods that they use to choose their variables, how they assign the weighting to it. So that's a pretty good how-to guide to build one. And then we'll see, does it fit the Hamilton context? And we want to also compare it to some of the other models. So we'll look at the Ontario marginalization. We'll look at the recently completed equity models that have come before council and see, are we getting a different result? Is it similar? So we'll do some of that comparing and contrasting. And then our intent was to use it with asset owners to start just asking some of those questions and seeing the results we get, and feel that that'll inform some of their future plans to go forward. And that would be our first start. And then depending upon the outcome of that will depend on, I guess, the next steps with this tool as we bring that work forward.
My last question through you, Chair, is I'm super, super interested in the Ontario marginalization, how you did the overlay on Hamilton. I get that it's just meant to be for illustration purposes only. However, it was still super interesting because it did reinforce a lot of the sections of the city that I think would be most marginalized, looking at Ward 2, Ward 3. Ward 4 is a little pink. I was thinking it was a little bit darker, deeper shade of a pink. So I'm curious about where you accessed this concept, and is there a way for us to just poke around and play with something like that?
So really, that concept came from looking at what Ottawa had done and saying, could we do something similar just really fast at the City of Hamilton? And the Ontario marginalization data is publicly available. So they actually have a really wonderful data file that has all of the census information identified. And so then using our GIS system, was able to just essentially plot the data onto our Hamilton mapping, and then just to see kind of what it looked like.
Oh, is that anything that you can share, even with a giant disclaimer that says just for illustration purposes only? But I'm just genuinely curious in this particular information.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can look at sharing.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Councillor Huang. Next up, we have Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could just help me understand the sequence of how information is going to be used when council ultimately has to make some, what I've heard this morning, maybe some hard choices in the near future. I've heard reference to asset rationalization. So if I could maybe give a hypothetical. Let's just pretend there's a ward and there's a neighborhood in the ward that for reasons beyond the local government control, over here is a provincial funding formula that doesn't include the cost of building university residence in its dispensation. So as a consequence, the university doesn't build student residence, but it still needs students in order to uphold its business model. And or it also needs international students because you get a whole bunch more tuition. So over time, the impact that that might have on this hypothetical neighborhood is that some of the homes in that neighborhood get sold and they're turned into assets, business assets for student accommodation. So the families that lived in those homes, they move out, and then it maybe creates a self-fulfilling. The more homes that are assetized, it becomes maybe less of an appealing place for families to be. Then, as a consequence, another entity, the school board, comes along and it deems, well, we don't have enough students in this particular neighborhood to justify this elementary school. So we're going to close that elementary school. Then all of that information combines to inform our recreational plans. Well, we don't have enough children in that said neighborhood to justify this particular recreational asset, or we don't have enough children to justify the allocation of a new recreational asset. So if you could help me in this hypothetical instance, how or will this equity information, might it be used in the sequence of decision making when it comes to those hard decisions? Through the chair. And it becomes, an forever uphill climb in trying to maybe attract a mixed use of individuals in that neighborhood.
I'll jump in as an attempt to answer this. I think you've described a situation that involves a lot of different factors that have influenced the reality of this fictitious neighborhood that you've described, including aspects that may be a planning component in terms of the use of the housing in the community and how that's evolved. I think that the equity matrix and tool that we're looking at really creates a snapshot of the current situation for a neighborhood, and would not likely bring into the storytelling of the history of how it got there, but would look at the what is the demographics and the factors there at present. And this tool is a tool. It would be used to engage in dialogue, in decision making based on how we prioritize things as staff recommends, and then at the direction that council would support of what we really do with that. So it's a bit of a vague answer, but I think that what we're trying to do is lay some groundwork here so that we can have more informed discussions around how we would make those decisions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that's just my only flag of caution in these discussions. Because these are snapshots in time, even with the best of data, for example, that these decisions will be affected, I would hope, on other public goals. So we know that there are neighborhoods in this city. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we deemed them to be code red. In those neighborhoods, we have individuals that don't have the time or capacity to advocate and engage. And then when we maybe make a decision about rationalization, then we can further facilitate the disparity, if you will, in that neighborhood because there's no access to a certain public asset. Then it becomes more difficult to attract others, other incomes, other people to reside in that because, well, there's no pool, there's no school, there's no, because we've rationalized and you start to solidify the condition of that neighborhood, which I would think would be not in even our financial self-interest to do so. So I just, I appreciate that tough decisions are going to be had. I appreciate that this information must be included in that. I'm just adding to it, you know, the longer term lens beyond that snapshot in time. Thank you for the leniency.
Thank you, committee members. That exhausts our speakers list, and that now officially covers all the presentations that were on the agenda for today. So I'll need a mover and seconder to receive the presentations and the reports under 7.1A, B, and C. And I saw some hands in my peripheral, Councillor Kassar, Councillor Huang, and that is a show of hands report as it's just a receipt. Anybody opposed? That carries. Okay, that takes care of our business. Again, thank you to everybody for your preparation for today's meeting. Really appreciate the thoroughness of the response to committee's questions, really important considerations leading up to our budget process. Thank you, everyone.